We begin our journey in Mesopotamia, known as the cradle of civilization, a place where many of the elements that shape human society today were first imagined and implemented. The very name Mesopotamia means land between the rivers, referring to the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that cradled this ancient land, offering it both fertility and sustenance. Here, around 3100 BC, one of the world's first major cities, Uruk, emerged. This city, with its ziggurats, marketplaces, and bustling streets, symbolized a new way of life and established Mesopotamia as a center of human innovation. The importance of Mesopotamia lies in the fact that it wasn't merely a birthplace of one city but rather a network of cities and societies, each leaving behind legacies in language, governance, and culture. Picture a typical day in Uruk, the streets filled with artisans, traders, priests, and farmers, the hum of early civilization vibrating through the air. The people of Uruk were inventive, creating the earliest known form of writing, cuneiform, initially to track agricultural and economic transactions. What began as symbols for commodities grew into complex narratives, myths, and laws, opening the door to recorded history itself. The Sumerians, as they were known, gave us more than just written language. They created a blueprint for urban life that included specialized labor, administration, and laws. At the heart of these cities were grand temple complexes, towering ziggurats, which symbolized the spiritual and political center of life. The ziggurats were not just temples but seats of administration, serving both the gods and the king who ruled in their name. Sumerian rulers claimed divine authority, which allowed them to maintain control over the populace, collect taxes, and organize labor for ambitious construction projects. As society grew, so did the complexities of governance. Early Mesopotamian rulers, like those in Uruk, faced the challenge of keeping track of resources and governing a rapidly expanding population. And so, the first known legal codes emerged, evolving into systems that outlined property rights, trade agreements, and punishments for crimes. Among the most famous of these is Hammurabi's Code, developed much later by the Amorite king Hammurabi, who ruled Babylon. This code was a comprehensive set of laws engraved on a stone stele for all to see, proclaiming, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." Hammurabi's code wasn't merely a document of rules, it was a symbol of justice and order that sought to legitimize the king's authority and the structure of Mesopotamian society. The concept of justice was tied to the belief that the gods desired harmony and that a lawful society would be rewarded. Yet, these laws were also reflective of a rigid class system where penalties varied depending on one's social status. The concept of fairness, though groundbreaking, was still colored by the inherent hierarchies of the time. Life in Mesopotamia was deeply influenced by the pantheon of gods, each overseeing different aspects of existence. Anu was the sky god, and Enlil ruled the wind, while Inanna, later known as Ishtar, was the goddess of love, beauty, and war. Mesopotamians believed that human beings were created by the gods to serve them, and they viewed natural disasters or prosperity as direct messages from the divine. Religious festivals, rituals, and offerings were integral to daily life. Priests and priestesses held significant power as intermediaries between the divine and mortal worlds, conducting ceremonies, divinations, and sacrifices to appease the gods and ensure the well-being of society. The people of Mesopotamia were no strangers to conflict. As city-states grew in wealth and power, competition for resources and land intensified. Neighboring regions and city-states frequently clashed, with powerful rulers attempting to extend their domains. The region's rich agricultural land and strategic position made it a target for invasions, both by rival Mesopotamian cities and by foreign powers. Military prowess became an essential aspect of Mesopotamian rulers' authority, leading to the rise of professional soldiers and ultimately the development of advanced siege warfare tactics. Trade played a pivotal role in connecting Mesopotamia to the wider world. The people of Mesopotamia bartered their surplus goods with distant lands, exchanging textiles, grains, and pottery for luxury items like lapis lazuli, copper, and precious stones. These trade networks reached as far as the Indus Valley, the Levant, and even Egypt. This exchange of goods also fostered an exchange of ideas and technologies, shaping the region's art, culture, and innovations. Yet, despite their remarkable achievements, the people of Mesopotamia lived in a fragile environment. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, while life-giving, could be unpredictable and devastating. Floods were a constant threat, as were periods of drought, and the lack of natural barriers left the land vulnerable to invasions. The people attributed these natural challenges to the will of the gods, believing that they must appease them to maintain balance. The famous Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature, encapsulates this worldview. The story follows King Gilgamesh of Uruk as he embarks on a journey to discover the secret of immortality, only to learn that human life is fleeting and that true legacy lies in the impact one leaves behind. As the centuries passed, the region saw the rise and fall of various powers, each leaving its mark on Mesopotamian culture. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great was one of the first to establish a united realm stretching across the Fertile Crescent. Sargon's conquests laid the groundwork for future empires and established Akkadian as the lingua franca of the region. The Assyrians, too, rose to prominence, building a vast empire known for its formidable army and advanced administrative systems. Assyrian kings, like Ashurbanipal, amassed vast libraries of knowledge, preserving Mesopotamian literature, science, and religious texts for future generations. Each new ruling power brought changes, but also continuity. The Babylonians, who succeeded the Assyrians, preserved and enhanced Sumerian traditions, while adding their own innovations in astronomy and mathematics. Babylon became a center of learning, and its ziggurat, the Tower of Babel, was a marvel of engineering. The Babylonians furthered the use of mathematics, developing a base 60 number system that gave us the concept of the 360-degree circle and the 60-minute hour. The fall of Mesopotamia was a gradual process, weakened by internal strife, environmental challenges, and the continual onslaught of outside forces. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great, eventually absorbed the region into their vast empire. Today, the story of Mesopotamia reminds us of humanity's capacity for innovation, resilience, and adaptation. The ruins of Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh stand as testaments to an age when humanity took its first steps toward building complex societies. The people of Mesopotamia laid the groundwork for much of what we consider civilization, structured governance, written language, and organized religion. Their achievements echo through the ages, reminding us that even in the cradle of civilization, people grappled with the same questions we face today. How do we build a fair society? Moving west from the fertile lands of Mesopotamia, we arrive at the banks of the Nile, in the heart of a civilization that saw itself as eternal, ancient Egypt. Here, among the deserts of northeastern Africa, life thrived in a way that it did nowhere else in the ancient world. The Nile, stretching over 4,000 miles, was not just a river, it was the lifeblood of an entire society, providing water, fertile soil, and a reliable means of transport. Egyptian civilization grew and flourished thanks to the river's predictable cycles of flooding, which brought nutrient-rich silt to the land each year. This gift of the Nile allowed Egypt to produce an agricultural surplus, giving rise to a stable society where rulers could focus on art, architecture, and religion rather than mere survival. Imagine walking through the fields of the Nile Delta during the planting season, where farmers toil under the sun, sowing grains that will eventually feed an empire. Farmers and laborers worked tirelessly, knowing that their efforts would sustain both the people and the grandeur of their civilization. The Nile's blessings, however, did not just feed the body, they nourished the soul of a civilization that built its worldview on harmony, order, and continuity. The Egyptians called this balance ma'at, a concept that guided every aspect of their lives, from daily routines to royal decrees. At the heart of Egyptian society stood the pharaoh, a ruler who was more than a king, he was a living god. Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was an incarnation of Horus, the falcon-headed god, and that upon death, he would join the sun god Ra in his journey across the sky. As a god on earth, the pharaoh had absolute power, and it was his divine duty to uphold Ma'at, ensuring order and stability throughout the land. The pharaoh's authority was unmatched, but it came with immense responsibilities. He was expected to lead armies into battle, administer justice, and above all, appease the gods to secure the prosperity of Egypt. The construction of monumental structures, such as temples and tombs, was one way the pharaoh fulfilled these responsibilities. The most iconic of these monuments are, of course, the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built for the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BC, is a marvel of engineering that has captivated the world for millennia. Rising 481 feet, it was the tallest structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. To build such a colossal tomb required an unprecedented mobilization of resources, labor, and skill. Contrary to popular belief, the workers who built the pyramids were not slaves but skilled laborers who believed they were performing sacred work. For them, building the pharaoh's tomb was an act of devotion, an assurance that their ruler would be safe in the afterlife, watching over Egypt from beyond the grave. The pyramids were more than tombs. They were spiritual machines designed to guide the soul of the pharaoh to the afterlife. Egyptian religion was centered on the belief in an afterlife, a journey that all souls would undertake after death. The Egyptians believed that when a person died, their soul was judged by Osiris, the god of the dead, in a ritual known as the weighing of the heart. In this ceremony, the heart of the deceased was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was found to be heavier, burdened with sins, the soul was devoured by Ammit, a fearsome creature part lion, hippopotamus, and crocodile. But if the heart was pure, the soul would be granted eternal life in the field of reeds, a paradise mirroring the fertile lands of the Nile. This profound belief in the afterlife led to the practice of mummification, a method developed over centuries to preserve the body for eternity. The Egyptians believed that the soul needed a physical vessel to live on in the afterlife, so they perfected the art of embalming, extracting organs, and wrapping the body in linen to prevent decay. Elaborate tombs filled with food, furniture, and treasures were prepared to ensure that the deceased had everything they would need in the next world. The tomb paintings and inscriptions, known as the pyramid texts or Book of the Dead, served as a guide for the soul, helping it navigate the trials and tribulations of the underworld. Beyond the pharaoh and the afterlife, Egyptian society was highly stratified, with a complex hierarchy of nobles, priests, artisans, and farmers. Priests held a special place in this hierarchy, as they served as intermediaries between the people and the gods. Temples were not only places of worship but also centers of economic and political power. They owned vast tracts of land, managed agricultural production, and employed thousands of workers. The temples to Ammonius-Ra at Karnak and Luxor, with their towering columns and intricate carvings, were architectural masterpieces that demonstrated the wealth and piety of the Egyptian state. The role of women in Egypt was notably different from many other ancient civilizations. Egyptian women could own property, initiate divorce, and engage in business. Some even rose to positions of power, the most famous being Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh who ruled Egypt for over 20 years. Her reign was marked by peace, prosperity, and extensive building projects. She is often depicted wearing a false beard, the traditional symbol of pharaonic authority, asserting her legitimacy in a male-dominated institution. Another powerful woman was Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of Egypt before it fell to Rome. Her intelligence, political acumen, and alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony made her a formidable force, and her legacy endures as a symbol of both Egyptian power and the end of an era. The Egyptians were masterful artists, creating a distinctive style that has been instantly recognizable for thousands of years. Their art was not only a form of decoration but a means of conveying religious and cultural values. The style was highly stylized, with figures shown in profile and strict conventions governing the depiction of gods, pharaohs, and ordinary people. This art adorned temples, tombs, and monuments, depicting scenes of daily life, religious rituals, and mythological tales. The colors used in Egyptian art held symbolic meaning: green for fertility, blue for the Nile, and gold for the divine. However, despite Egypt's seeming stability, it was not immune to conflict and change. The Old Kingdom, known as the Age of the Pyramids, eventually collapsed due to a combination of internal strife, famine, and the loss of centralized power. This period, known as the First Intermediate Period, saw the fragmentation of Egypt into competing local dynasties. Order was restored with the Middle Kingdom, but the cycle repeated itself, leading to the rise of the New Kingdom, Egypt's most powerful era. The New Kingdom, from approximately 1550 to 1070 BC, was Egypt's imperial age, marked by military conquests and a vast expansion of territory. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II led campaigns into Nubia, Canaan, and Syria, establishing Egypt as a regional superpower. Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, was one of Egypt's most celebrated rulers. He is remembered not only for his military achievements but also for his extensive building projects, including the grand temples at Abu Simbel. His reign was one of prosperity, but it also marked the beginning of Egypt's slow decline. Next, our journey brings us east to the vast plains and river valleys of the Indian subcontinent, where the ancient Indus Valley civilization flourished. Located around the Indus and Sarasvati rivers, covering parts of modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, this civilization reached its peak around 2600 to 1900 BC. In an age defined by monumental temples, grandiose rulers, and dynastic conquests, the Indus Valley stands out for its subtle yet groundbreaking approach to urban planning, social organization, and trade. Imagine walking through the streets of Mohenjo-daro, one of the largest cities in this civilization. The layout alone is impressive, a meticulously planned grid system, with wide streets, sophisticated drainage systems, and standardized brick houses. Unlike other early civilizations, the Indus Valley seemed less focused on grandiose monuments or extravagant displays of wealth. Instead, it was the practical, functional, and organized design that made its cities extraordinary. The inhabitants of this civilization prioritized cleanliness, order, and efficiency in ways that feel remarkably modern. At the heart of Mohenjo-daro, you would see the Great Bath, a large public water tank that served as a communal space, possibly for ritualistic cleansing. The design of this bath is advanced, with watertight brickwork, stairs leading down on either side, and an ingenious drainage system that kept the area clean and maintained. Scholars debate its purpose. Was it a center for religious ceremonies, a public gathering space, or perhaps even an early form of a bathhouse? Whatever its role, the Great Bath illustrates a society that valued hygiene, public infrastructure, and a sense of community. The people of the Indus Valley were remarkable builders, as evidenced by their uniformly structured houses and public buildings. Houses were made from standardized fired bricks, and many were 2 or even 3 stories tall. This uniformity hints at a highly organized society with advanced knowledge of construction techniques. Homes often had access to private wells, and nearly every household was connected to an intricate underground drainage system, one of the earliest in the world. The sophistication of this sewage system would not be matched until the Roman Empire, over 1,000 years later. Such systems ensured a level of cleanliness and disease control that was rare in the ancient world, allowing the civilization to thrive in densely populated urban centers. The people of the Indus Valley also had a profound understanding of water management. The region was subject to seasonal monsoons, which could bring both life-giving rains and catastrophic floods. To mitigate this, the Indus Valley people built artificial reservoirs and practiced techniques like water harvesting and storage. This water management system allowed them to sustain agriculture and maintain urban centers even in times of drought, a critical factor for survival in the unpredictable climate of the subcontinent. But who were the people of the Indus Valley? This question remains one of history's great mysteries, as their language, if it was indeed a language, remains undeciphered. Unlike other ancient cultures, they left behind no grand inscriptions or lengthy records. Instead, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of small stone seals, adorned with images of animals, symbols, and what appears to be a script. These seals, often featuring motifs like bulls, elephants, and mythical creatures, are some of the most fascinating artifacts of this civilization. They may have been used for trade, serving as a form of identification or branding. The script on the seals, however, has yet to be deciphered, leaving a significant gap in our understanding of their language, beliefs, and governance. The Indus Valley people engaged in extensive trade, connecting them to distant lands, including Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence suggests that they traded goods like beads, cotton textiles, and metals, as well as luxury items such as lapis lazuli and carnelian. This trade network allowed the civilization to prosper economically and culturally, exchanging ideas and technologies with neighboring regions. Merchants and artisans were likely important members of society, contributing not only to the economy but also to the diffusion of cultural and technological innovations across ancient Asia. Yet, unlike the Mesopotamians or Egyptians, the Indus Valley civilization does not seem to have a centralized or highly stratified system of power. There are no grand palaces, no extravagant tombs, no depictions of powerful kings. This absence of royal or priestly authority in the archaeological record is puzzling, leading scholars to speculate about the nature of their social and political organization. Perhaps they were governed by councils or assemblies, with power more evenly distributed among different groups. Some suggest that they may have had a proto-democratic system, a radical concept for the ancient world, where the distribution of resources and decision-making were communal rather than centralized. This could explain the striking uniformity in urban planning and the emphasis on collective infrastructure. Religion in the Indus Valley is also shrouded in mystery. Unlike the elaborate temples of Mesopotamia or the pyramids of Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization left behind no grand religious structures. Some artifacts, however, provide hints. Small figurines, often of female forms, suggest that they may have practiced a form of goddess worship, possibly linked to fertility. A particular seal shows a figure seated in a meditative posture, surrounded by animals. Some scholars believe this could represent an early form of the god Shiva, known as Pashupati, or Lord of Animals, suggesting a connection to later Hindu beliefs. Yet, without written records, these interpretations remain speculative, offering only glimpses into a religious world that is both intriguing and elusive. Despite their accomplishments, the decline of the Indus Valley civilization around 1900 BCE is as enigmatic as its rise. Climate change, specifically a shift in monsoon patterns, is one theory. The weakening of the monsoons may have dried up the rivers that sustained the civilization, forcing people to abandon their cities in search of water and arable land. Others suggest that the drying of the Sarasvati River, a once mighty river that likely sustained many Indus cities, could have led to agricultural decline and urban collapse. Another theory suggests that invasions from Indo-Aryan tribes played a role in their downfall, though evidence for this is limited. It's possible that a combination of factors, environmental, economic, and social, contributed to the gradual abandonment of cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. By around 1300 BC, the Indus Valley cities were largely deserted, their sophisticated urban systems falling into ruin. The legacy of the Indus Valley, however, endures. Their advancements in urban planning, water management, and trade influenced later civilizations in the region. Some aspects of their culture, particularly in art and symbolism, appear to have influenced Vedic culture, which arose in India after the decline of the Indus Valley. Modern-day India and Pakistan still carry echoes of the Indus civilization in their cultural practices, architectural layouts, and perhaps even in their spiritual beliefs. As we journey eastward, we find ourselves in the heart of one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, China. By the 2nd millennium BC, along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, a unique civilization emerged, one that would grow to view itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world. This is a place of remarkable innovation, resilience, and an unwavering sense of continuity, where the early dynasties of China laid the foundation for a society that would endure for thousands of years. Imagine standing on the banks of the Yellow River, often referred to as the cradle of Chinese civilization. Its fertile plains nurtured early farming communities, but this river, while life-giving, was also temperamental. Its frequent, devastating floods led to the river being called China's sorrow. From the very beginning, the people of China understood the importance of unity, cooperation, and effective leadership to control and harness the power of nature. And so, they turned to leaders who could bring order to chaos, giving rise to the first dynasties that would rule China. The Xia dynasty is considered China's earliest dynasty, though it exists on the border of history and myth. It's from the Xia period that we hear of legendary figures like Yu the Great, a hero who is said to have tamed the floods of the Yellow River. According to legend, Yu worked tirelessly, digging channels and creating dikes to divert the water, saving countless lives and transforming fertile lands for cultivation. The story of Yu the Great reflects China's ancient and enduring respect for leaders who can harmonize nature and society. It also marks the beginning of a concept central to Chinese civilization, the mandate of heaven. The mandate of heaven was a divine right to rule, granted by heaven, a force seen as the ultimate authority. Unlike in Egypt or Mesopotamia, where rulers were considered gods or representatives of specific deities, the Chinese ruler or emperor was understood to be the son of heaven. His power was legitimate as long as he governed justly and harmoniously. If he failed, if his rule brought disaster, corruption, or famine, the mandate could be withdrawn, and another ruler could take his place. This concept of conditional legitimacy was revolutionary, providing a built-in mechanism for societal renewal and a philosophical justification for the rise and fall of dynasties. The Xia dynasty was followed by the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BC, which provides us with the first confirmed records of Chinese writing. In the Shang capital Anyang, archaeologists have uncovered oracle bones, tortoise shells and cattle bones inscribed with early Chinese characters. These inscriptions give us a glimpse into the spiritual life of the Shang people, who practiced divination to communicate with ancestors and predict the future. Questions inscribed on oracle bones range from mundane matters like crop planting to critical decisions of war and peace. This early writing system, a precursor to modern Chinese script, connects today's language to a tradition spanning over 3,000 years, a continuous link between ancient and modern China. The Shang were renowned for their bronze work, creating ritual vessels and weapons of extraordinary craftsmanship. These bronze items were not only functional but also held spiritual significance, often used in ancestor worship ceremonies. Ancestor worship was a central aspect of Shang culture and would remain a cornerstone of Chinese spiritual life. The Shang believed that their deceased ancestors could influence the living, offering protection or, if displeased, causing misfortune. This deep reverence for family and ancestry shaped Chinese values, emphasizing filial piety, respect for elders, and loyalty to family, a cultural thread that runs through Chinese history. But even the powerful Shang dynasty could not rule forever. Around 1046 BC, they were overthrown by the Zhou, a people from the west, who had established the longest-lasting dynasty in Chinese history. The Zhou rulers invoked the mandate of heaven to legitimize their rule, claiming that the Shang had lost the mandate due to corruption and moral decay. The Zhou dynasty ushered in a new era, characterized by philosophical and cultural achievements that would shape Chinese civilization profoundly. The early Zhou period, known as the Western Zhou, saw a feudal system take root in China. The king divided the land among his loyal relatives and nobles, creating a network of states that paid tribute to the central authority. This feudal structure encouraged regional autonomy, but it also sowed the seeds of future conflicts. As time passed, local lords grew more powerful, eventually leading to the fragmentation of the Zhou state. This period of division, known as the Spring and Autumn period, would give way to the infamous Warring States period, a time of relentless conflict and instability. Yet, paradoxically, this era of warfare also became a golden age of philosophy, producing some of the most influential thinkers in human history. Confucius, born during this time, proposed a vision of society built on ethics, education, and respect for tradition. He emphasized the importance of family, social harmony, and moral integrity, advocating for a society where rulers governed with virtue rather than brute force. Confucianism would become the ideological backbone of Chinese civilization, deeply influencing its education system, governance, and social structure for centuries. Another philosophical school that arose during the Warring States period was Taoism, founded by the mystical Laozi. Unlike Confucianism, which focused on social order and ethical duties, Taoism emphasized harmony with nature, the pursuit of inner peace, and the rejection of rigid structures. Taoist philosophy encouraged people to follow the Tao, or the Way, a concept representing the natural order of the universe. Taoism taught that true wisdom lay in simplicity, humility, and an understanding of one's place within the greater cosmos. Together, Confucianism and Taoism offered complementary paths to understanding life and society, shaping Chinese thought and spirituality for millennia. Meanwhile, the Warring States period also saw the rise of legalism, a pragmatic and authoritarian philosophy that viewed human nature as fundamentally selfish and advocated strict laws to maintain social order. Legalist thinkers argued that only a strong, centralized authority could end the chaos of war and division. Legalism would later provide the ideological foundation for the Qin dynasty, which would unify China for the first time. The Qin dynasty, though short-lived, was one of the most transformative periods in Chinese history. In 221 BC, the ambitious ruler Qin Shi Huang defeated rival states and declared himself the first emperor of a unified China. Under his rule, the empire saw sweeping reforms. He standardized the writing system, weights and measures, and even the width of cart axles, facilitating trade and communication across the vast territory. Qin Shi Huang also initiated the construction of the Great Wall, a monumental project aimed at defending China from northern invaders. But his rule was also marked by ruthless policies and strict control, as evidenced by the burning of books and persecution of scholars to suppress dissent. Despite his achievements, Qin Shi Huang's authoritarian rule would provoke widespread resentment, leading to the dynasty's collapse shortly after his death. Now, we cross seas and mountains to arrive in the land of myth and reason, where humanity would shape ideas that continue to define the modern world, ancient Greece. The Greek civilization wasn't defined by vast empires or monumental temples like some others we've explored. Instead, its power lay in its ideas, in the deep wells of thought and creativity that would profoundly influence philosophy, science, government, and art for generations to come. Imagine walking through Athens during the 5th century BC, often called the Golden Age of Greece. Here, amidst white marble temples and bustling marketplaces, citizens debate questions about morality, knowledge, and the nature of the universe. This city-state, or polis, is small compared to the vast empires of Persia or Egypt, but within its walls, some of history's most remarkable minds are gathering, engaging in conversations that would ignite the intellectual and cultural heritage of Western civilization. At the heart of Athenian life is the agora, the central public space, bustling with people, philosophers, merchants, craftsmen, and citizens discussing politics and ideas. The Athenians believed that civic participation wasn't just a privilege, it was a duty, a fundamental part of being human. This sense of civic responsibility gave birth to one of their most important innovations, democracy. While it was limited by today's standards, with only male citizens allowed to vote and slavery still present, Athenian democracy was groundbreaking. For the first time, ordinary citizens had a say in the governance of their city, voting on laws and policy, and making decisions that shaped the destiny of their society. The assembly, or ecclesia, where Athenians met to debate and vote, was an open forum where every citizen had the right to speak. Imagine this, a society where decisions were not dictated by a single ruler or an aristocratic class, but by collective discourse. This experiment in democracy, with all its flaws and limitations, laid the foundation for future generations to explore ideas of freedom, equality, and representation. But democracy was not the only gift Greece gave to the world. This was also the era of remarkable intellectual flourishing. The Greek philosophers, or lovers of wisdom, sought to understand the world not through myths or divine edicts, but through reason and observation. Socrates, a towering figure in Greek philosophy, roamed the streets of Athens, engaging people in discussions, challenging assumptions, and encouraging self-examination. He famously said, "The unexamined life is not worth living," urging his fellow citizens to question everything, to seek truth rather than accept things at face value. Socrates' method of inquiry, which we now call the Socratic method, was based on asking questions to reveal contradictions in a person's beliefs, encouraging them to think critically and logically. His influence on Western thought cannot be overstated. He set a precedent for questioning authority, challenging dogma, and seeking knowledge. Socrates himself never wrote anything down, but his ideas were immortalized by his student, Plato, who would become one of history's greatest philosophers. Plato, inspired by his mentor's commitment to truth, established the Academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. In his dialogues he explored ideas about justice, reality, and governance, creating theories that continue to shape philosophical thought. Plato was deeply disillusioned by the flaws he saw in Athenian democracy, particularly after witnessing the execution of Socrates, whom the state condemned for allegedly corrupting the youth. In his famous work, The Republic, Plato imagined an ideal society governed by philosopher kings, wise rulers who would guide society based on reason rather than personal ambition. His ideas would influence thinkers for centuries, shaping everything from political theory to metaphysics. Yet another of Plato's students would take Greek thought in a different direction, Aristotle. Unlike Plato, who often favored abstract ideals, Aristotle focused on the empirical world, observing and categorizing the natural phenomena around him. From biology to politics, ethics to physics, Aristotle's works encompass a vast range of knowledge, making him one of the most prolific thinkers in history. His scientific approach laid the groundwork for the development of fields like biology, zoology, and logic, and his ideas on ethics and politics continue to be studied and debated. Aristotle's belief in the importance of moderation, or the golden mean, emphasizes a balanced approach to life and is a principle that still resonates today. While the Greeks were exploring ideas about governance and knowledge, they were also creating timeless works of art, literature, and drama. Greek playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote tragedies that examined the human condition, delving into themes of fate, hubris, and moral conflict. In their plays, gods and mortals struggle, not only with each other but with themselves, revealing the complex, often tragic nature of human existence. These dramas, performed in grand open-air theaters, were not merely entertainment. They were a form of public discourse, a way for the Greeks to grapple with ethical and social issues, challenging audiences to reflect on their own lives. Greek art, too, sought to capture ideals of beauty, balance, and proportion. Sculptors like Phidias and Polykleitos created statues of gods and heroes that embodied the Greek ideals of harmony and perfection. The human form was celebrated, depicted in dynamic poses that conveyed both strength and grace. Greek art didn't aim for realism in the way we think of it today. Rather, it aspired to an idealized vision of humanity, one that would inspire later civilizations in their own artistic pursuits. In architecture, the Greeks designed structures that reflected their sense of balance and order. The Parthenon, a temple dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and war, is perhaps the most iconic example of Greek architecture. Its harmonious proportions and intricate sculptures make it a masterpiece of design, a symbol of the values and ideals that defined Athens. Greek temples and public buildings were places where the gods were honored, but they also represented the community's commitment to beauty, reason, and civic pride. The achievements of ancient Greece were not limited to Athens alone. The city-state of Sparta, with its militaristic society, provided a counterpoint to Athenian culture. While Athens celebrated democracy, philosophy, and the arts, Sparta focused on discipline, strength, and loyalty. Spartan society was structured around a warrior ethos, with boys entering rigorous military training at a young age to prepare them for lives of service and combat. Spartan women, unlike those in most Greek city-states, had relatively more rights and were trained to be strong and resilient, supporting the state's emphasis on strength and endurance. The contrasting values of Athens and Sparta would eventually lead to conflict, culminating in the Peloponnesian War, a brutal struggle that would weaken both states and bring an end to Greece's golden age. We now enter the gates of ancient Rome, a city that would grow from a humble settlement along the Tiber River to one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. Rome's story is one of ambition, innovation, and unyielding discipline, shaping a legacy that continues to influence law, governance, language, architecture, and even the way we view power itself. For nearly 1,000 years, Rome's armies would march across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, its culture and institutions binding together a vast and diverse empire. In the beginning, Rome was a monarchy, founded, according to legend, by the twin brothers Romulus and Remus. Raised by a she-wolf, these brothers would become symbols of Rome's strength and resilience. Romulus, after a fateful dispute, killed his brother and named the new city after himself, Rome. Although the story of Romulus and Remus is more myth than history, it captures the spirit of Rome, fierce, ambitious, and willing to fight for survival. Around 509 BC, the Romans overthrew their monarchy, establishing the Roman Republic, a government that would become a model for centuries to come. At its core was the principle of residential publica, the public thing, a system designed to prevent any single individual from holding too much power. The Republic was governed by a complex system of checks and balances, with elected officials, known as magistrates, serving in various roles. 2 consuls shared executive power, balancing each other's influence, and acting as the highest officials in the land. Beneath them were other officials like the praetors, aediles, and quaestors, each with specific responsibilities that helped the Republic function. The Roman Senate, an assembly of Rome's most respected and powerful men, advised the magistrates and controlled finances and foreign policy. Membership in the Senate was for life, ensuring a continuity of governance but also creating an elite ruling class that wielded significant influence. The Senate became the symbol of Roman stability and wisdom, guiding the Republic through times of crisis and expansion. Senators often came from noble families, known as patricians, who represented Rome's old aristocracy. The common people, or plebeians, initially had little power, but over time they fought for and won the right to elect their own representatives, known as tribunes. The tribunes had the power to veto decisions that they believed were harmful to the people, giving the plebeians a voice in the government and helping to prevent abuses of power. As Rome expanded, it encountered rival powers that would test its resolve. Among the most formidable of these were the Carthaginians, a wealthy and powerful city-state in North Africa. The conflict between Rome and Carthage erupted into a series of wars known as the Punic Wars, a struggle that would last over a century. The most famous Carthaginian leader was Hannibal Barca, a brilliant general who led his army, complete with war elephants, over the Alps to invade Italy. For years, Hannibal wreaked havoc in the Italian countryside, defeating Roman legions in battle after battle. The Romans, however, refused to surrender. They adapted their tactics, striking at Carthaginian allies and cutting off Hannibal's supplies, eventually forcing him to return to Carthage to defend his homeland. In 202 BC, the Roman general Scipio Africanus defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, ending the Second Punic War and securing Rome's dominance over the western Mediterranean. Rome's victory over Carthage marked the beginning of its transformation from a regional power to an empire. Over the next centuries, Roman legions would conquer Greece, Spain, Gaul, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor, bringing diverse cultures and peoples under Roman rule. The Republic, however, was not designed to govern such a vast empire. Corruption, social inequality, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few powerful families destabilized Roman society. Ambitious generals, who had gained loyalty from their soldiers through promises of land and wealth, began to challenge the authority of the Senate, leading to a series of civil wars that would ultimately destroy the Republic. One of the key figures in this tumultuous period was Julius Caesar, a brilliant military commander and politician who won fame and power through his conquest of Gaul. Caesar was both admired and feared, as his influence grew beyond the Senate's control. In 49 BC, he crossed the Rubicon River with his army, a daring act that amounted to a declaration of war on the Republic. His march on Rome triggered a civil war, pitting Caesar against his former ally, Pompey the Great, and the Senate's supporters. Caesar emerged victorious, seizing control of Rome and declaring himself dictator for life. Caesar's rise to power marked the end of the Republic. Though he enacted important reforms, such as redistributing land to the poor and restructuring the calendar, his authoritarian rule alienated many. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, a group of senators, including his close friend Brutus, assassinated him in an attempt to restore the Republic. Yet the assassination did not save the Republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into another round of civil wars, culminating in the rise of Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir, Octavian, who would become known as Augustus. Augustus emerged from the ashes of the Republic as the first Roman emperor, establishing the Roman Empire. His rule ushered in the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, a period of relative stability and prosperity that lasted for over 200 years. Augustus presented himself as the princeps, or first citizen, avoiding the title of king to respect Roman tradition, but he held absolute power. He reformed the administration, reorganized the army, and instituted public works projects, building aqueducts, roads, and temples that transformed Rome into a city of grandeur. The Roman Empire reached its height under Augustus, and his successors would continue to expand its borders, ruling over territories that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Mesopotamia. Under the emperors, Rome became a melting pot of cultures, a cosmopolitan center where diverse peoples, religions, and ideas coexisted. The empire's legal system, engineering feats, and urban planning left a lasting impact on the world. Roman law, in particular, laid the foundation for the legal systems of many modern countries. The Romans developed principles of justice, including the idea that all citizens have rights and that no one is above the law. These principles, though not always applied equally in practice, have influenced legal thinking for centuries. But the Roman Empire also faced significant challenges. The massive military and bureaucratic system required vast resources, and maintaining control over distant provinces became increasingly difficult. Corruption, economic instability, and overextension weakened the empire. The 3rd century CE brought a period of crisis, with invasions from Germanic tribes, civil wars, and a succession of short-lived emperors, each vying for power. Despite attempts at reform, the Western Roman Empire could not withstand the pressure. In 476 CE, the last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. This event marked the end of the Western Roman Empire, though the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, would continue for nearly 1,000 more years. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled, a new empire in the East continued to thrive, preserving the spirit of Rome while adapting to new cultural influences. This was the Byzantine Empire, an empire that would last for over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, blending Roman governance, Greek culture, and Christian faith into a powerful new civilization. Our journey begins in the heart of the Byzantine Empire, in the city of Constantinople. Founded by Emperor Constantine the Great in 330 CE, Constantinople was strategically located between Europe and Asia, making it a vital crossroads of trade, culture, and military might. The city, with its massive walls, bustling marketplaces, and grand churches, was a place of both opulence and strategic importance. Protected by the sea on 3 sides and formidable walls on the 4th, Constantinople would endure sieges, invasions, and civil wars, standing as a beacon of strength in a world beset by turmoil. The Byzantines saw themselves as Romans, heirs to the legacy of Caesar and Augustus. They retained Roman laws, administrative structures, and military traditions, but their culture evolved in its own unique direction. Greek became the dominant language, and Christianity became the state religion, deeply shaping Byzantine art, philosophy, and daily life. The emperor, viewed as God's representative on earth, held both political and religious authority, embodying a union of church and state that set the Byzantine Empire apart from its Western counterpart. One of the most iconic emperors in Byzantine history was Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565 CE. Justinian was a visionary, determined to restore the glory of Rome by reconquering lost territories in the West. His ambition drove the Byzantine armies to recapture parts of North Africa, Italy, and Spain, temporarily restoring a sense of Roman unity. His campaigns were costly and difficult, yet they underscored the Byzantine Empire's desire to uphold the legacy of Rome. However, Justinian's impact on Byzantine history extended far beyond his military conquests. Recognizing the need for a unified legal code, he commissioned scholars to compile Roman laws into a single, comprehensive system. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the Body of Civil Law, a monumental work that preserved Roman legal thought and became the foundation for civil law in many European countries. Justinian's code influenced legal systems around the world, ensuring that Roman law would endure long after the empire itself had faded. Justinian's reign also left a lasting mark on Byzantine architecture. Determined to create a grand symbol of Christian faith, he commissioned the construction of the Hagia Sophia, one of the architectural marvels of the ancient world. Completed in 537 CE, The Hagia Sophia was unlike anything seen before, with its massive dome appearing to float weightlessly above the interior space. Its walls glittered with mosaics of Christian saints, and its grandeur conveyed both the power of the Byzantine Empire and the spiritual devotion of its people. For nearly 1,000 years, the Hagia Sophia stood as the largest church in the world, inspiring awe and devotion in all who entered. The Byzantine Empire was not just a center of power, it was a center of culture and learning. Byzantine scholars preserved the works of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists, ensuring that their knowledge would not be lost to history. In monasteries and libraries, Byzantine scribes copied texts by Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy, creating a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. This knowledge would later be reintroduced to Western Europe during the Renaissance, sparking an intellectual revival that transformed European thought. Yet, the Byzantine Empire faced many challenges. Its strategic location, while advantageous for trade, also made it vulnerable to attacks from all directions. Over the centuries, the Byzantines fought off invasions from Persians, Arabs, Slavs, Bulgars, and others, often at great cost. They developed sophisticated military strategies, including the use of Greek fire, a fearsome incendiary weapon that could burn even on water, striking terror into the hearts of their enemies. Byzantine generals used clever tactics and diplomacy to fend off threats, maintaining the empire's independence even as it faced formidable opponents. The empire's survival was also due in part to its complex system of diplomacy. Byzantine diplomats were skilled at negotiating treaties, forming alliances, and using marriage as a tool to secure peace. Rather than relying solely on military power, they often played their enemies against one another, exploiting rivalries to protect their borders. This diplomacy allowed the Byzantine Empire to outlast many of its more powerful adversaries. However, internal strife often weakened the empire. Power struggles between emperors and ambitious nobles, as well as religious disputes, created instability. One of the most divisive controversies was the iconoclasm movement, which erupted in the 8th century. Iconoclasts, who believed that religious images, or icons, were idolatrous, sought to destroy them, while iconoclasts defended their use as a way to honor God and the saints. This conflict tore at the fabric of Byzantine society, pitting families, cities, and emperors against each other, and leaving deep scars on the empire's cultural heritage. By the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self, weakened by both external threats and internal decay. In 1071, the empire suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Manzikert, where the Seljuk Turks captured the emperor and seized control of much of Anatolia, the empire's heartland. This loss marked a turning point, exposing the vulnerability of the Byzantine Empire and setting the stage for further decline. In response to these challenges, the Byzantines turned to Western Europe for assistance, unintentionally sparking a series of events that would lead to the Crusades. Although the Crusaders initially aimed to help defend Byzantine territories, their motives soon shifted. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Crusader armies betrayed their Byzantine allies, sacking Constantinople in one of the darkest chapters of the empire's history. The city was looted, its treasures stolen, its churches desecrated, and its people brutalized. The Byzantines managed to reclaim Constantinople in 1261, but the empire was permanently weakened, its resources depleted, and its spirit broken. Despite these hardships, the Byzantine Empire endured, holding on for nearly 2 more centuries. Its final years were marked by a struggle for survival, as the Ottomans, a powerful Turkish empire, advanced steadily towards Constantinople. In 1453, after a prolonged siege, the Ottomans, led by Sultan Mehmed II, breached the city's walls. Constantinople fell, and with it, the Byzantine Empire came to an end. The city was renamed Istanbul, becoming the capital of the Ottoman Empire, but its legacy would live on. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the medieval Christian Empire, but Byzantine culture, art, and learning had already begun to influence the world beyond its borders. Byzantine scholars, fleeing the city, carried with them ancient Greek texts that would ignite the Renaissance in Western Europe. As we move from the Byzantine Empire, our journey brings us to a vibrant and transformative era in history, the Islamic Golden Age, a time when the Islamic world became a beacon of knowledge, culture, and innovation. Spanning from the 8th to the 14th centuries, this period saw remarkable achievements across various fields, from mathematics and medicine to philosophy and art. It was an era where scholars of different backgrounds, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and others, came together in a shared pursuit of knowledge, shaping a legacy that would influence the world for centuries to come. Our story begins with the rapid expansion of the Islamic Empire in the 7th century. Following the teachings of Prophet Muhammad, Arab armies conquered vast territories across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain, building an empire that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the borders of India. While the empire's expansion was marked by military success, it was the cultural and intellectual achievements that would leave a lasting legacy. The Islamic world became a melting pot of cultures, languages, and ideas, absorbing and preserving the knowledge of ancient civilizations like Greece, Rome, Persia, and India. This exchange of knowledge laid the groundwork for the Islamic Golden Age, a time of unprecedented learning and discovery. The heart of this intellectual renaissance was the city of Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, founded in 762 CE. The Abbasid caliphs, particularly Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Ma'mun, were passionate patrons of science, philosophy, and the arts. They established the House of Wisdom, a grand library and research center where scholars from across the empire gathered to translate and study ancient texts. Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian literature, and Chinese astronomy were all preserved, studied, and expanded upon within the walls of the House of Wisdom. This institution became a symbol of the Islamic Golden Age, attracting scholars from diverse backgrounds and fostering an environment of intellectual curiosity. One of the most profound contributions of the Islamic Golden Age was in the field of mathematics. Muslim mathematicians built upon the knowledge of the Greeks and Indians, making significant advances that would shape the future of science. The Persian scholar Al-Khwarizmi, often referred to as the father of algebra, wrote a groundbreaking book that introduced algebra as a systematic discipline. His work laid the foundation for solving linear and quadratic equations, and his name gave rise to the term algorithm. Al-Khwarizmi's innovations in mathematics revolutionized the way people approached calculations, influencing both the Islamic world and later Europe. The Islamic Golden Age also saw remarkable progress in the field of medicine. Scholars like Al-Razi, known in the West as Rhazes, and Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, produced medical texts that became essential references for centuries. Al-Razi wrote the Kitab al-Hawi, an extensive medical encyclopedia that compiled knowledge from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources, while also adding his own observations. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, a comprehensive medical text, covered topics such as anatomy, pharmacology, and the diagnosis of diseases. His work emphasized the importance of observation and experimentation, principles that would become the foundation of modern medicine. For centuries, the Canon of Medicine was used as a primary medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe, demonstrating the lasting influence of Islamic scholarship. Astronomy was another area where Islamic scholars made significant advancements. Muslim astronomers, drawing on Greek and Indian texts, made detailed observations of the night sky, developing models to explain the movement of celestial bodies. The Persian astronomer al-Biruni and the Andalusian polymath Ibn al-Zarqali made important contributions to our understanding of the solar system, including accurate calculations of the Earth's circumference and the development of precise astronomical tables. Observatories were built in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Samarkand, where astronomers studied the stars, improving tools like the astrolabe, which was used for navigation and timekeeping. These contributions were vital for later European explorations, as the knowledge of celestial navigation became essential for long sea voyages. The Islamic Golden Age was also a time of philosophical inquiry. Muslim philosophers, inspired by the works of Aristotle and Plato, sought to reconcile Greek philosophy with Islamic theology. Thinkers like Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd Averroes engaged in deep discussions about the nature of existence, the human soul, and the relationship between reason and faith. Ibn Rushd, in particular, argued that reason and revelation were compatible, emphasizing that philosophy could enhance one's understanding of God's creation. His writings would later influence Christian and Jewish thinkers in Europe, sparking a revival of Aristotelian philosophy during the Renaissance. In the realm of literature and the arts, the Islamic Golden Age produced masterpieces that continue to inspire. Persian poets like Rumi, Hafez, and Ferdowsi wrote epic poems, exploring themes of love, faith, and the human experience. Rumi's mystical poetry, filled with spiritual longing and devotion, transcends religious and cultural boundaries, appealing to people of all backgrounds. The Shahnameh, or Book of Kings by Ferdowsi, is an epic that tells the history of Persia through heroic tales, preserving Persian culture and heritage at a time when it was at risk of being lost. Calligraphy, geometric patterns, and intricate tile work became hallmarks of Islamic art, reflecting the Islamic emphasis on aniconism, or the avoidance of depicting human figures in religious art. Instead, artists created beautiful patterns and calligraphic designs, often featuring verses from the Quran, as a form of spiritual expression. Islamic architecture, with its domes, minarets, and courtyards, became an iconic style, blending aesthetic beauty with functionality. The Alhambra in Spain, the Great Mosque of Córdoba, and the Blue Mosque in Istanbul stand as enduring examples of Islamic architectural ingenuity and artistic skill. The Islamic Golden Age was not without its challenges. The vast empire faced political fragmentation, as local dynasties asserted independence, and rival caliphates emerged. The Abbasids struggled to maintain control over distant provinces, and by the 10th century, the empire had fractured into smaller, competing states. Despite these political divisions, the shared cultural and intellectual achievements of the Islamic world continued to flourish, uniting scholars and artists across borders. In the 13th century, the Islamic Golden Age faced a devastating blow with the Mongol invasions. The Mongols, under the leadership of Hulagu Khan, sacked Baghdad in 1258, destroying the House of Wisdom and killing thousands of scholars, citizens, and officials. The loss of Baghdad, the cultural and intellectual heart of the Islamic world, marked a turning point. Although the Mongols would later convert to Islam and adopt many aspects of Islamic culture, the unity and intellectual vibrancy of the Islamic Golden Age could not be fully restored. Our journey now moves westward, to the edge of an era that would forever change humanity's understanding of the world, the Age of Exploration. This period, spanning the 15th to the 17th centuries, was marked by European navigators venturing into unknown waters, discovering new lands, and establishing trade routes that bridged continents. Driven by the search for wealth, spices, and new trading partners, explorers sought to chart the globe, sailing through turbulent seas and uncharted waters, often facing tremendous risks and hardships along the way. The roots of the Age of Exploration can be traced back to advancements in navigation and shipbuilding that made long sea voyages possible. The Renaissance had revived European interest in knowledge and innovation, sparking curiosity about the natural world and distant lands. Meanwhile, the spread of Islam had linked European markets with Asia for centuries, but with the Ottoman Empire's rise, many overland trade routes to Asia became harder for Europeans to access. This led to a growing desire to bypass these routes and find direct paths to the riches of the East. Portugal took the lead in this pursuit, largely thanks to the visionary Prince Henry the Navigator. Though Prince Henry never sailed on any major voyages himself, he was instrumental in advancing navigation and exploration. He established a school for sailors at Sagres in the early 15th century, where scholars, sailors, and shipbuilders gathered to improve navigation techniques and cartography. Prince Henry's patronage enabled Portuguese explorers to map previously unknown parts of the African coast, bringing back gold, ivory, and slaves, as well as knowledge of previously unexplored lands. The Portuguese used innovative new ships called caravels, which were faster, more maneuverable, and better suited to ocean travel than their predecessors. Caravels could sail against the wind and navigate along rocky coastlines, making them ideal for exploratory voyages. Equipped with the astrolabe, an ancient Greek invention that allowed sailors to calculate latitude, and improved compasses, Portuguese navigators could now travel farther and more accurately than ever before. By the 1480s, Portuguese explorer Bartolomé Dias had successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, demonstrating that it was possible to reach the Indian Ocean by sea. This breakthrough opened the way for Vasco da Gama, who in 1498 became the first European to reach India by sea. Da Gama's voyage was a momentous achievement that established a direct maritime link between Europe and Asia, bypassing overland routes and initiating an era of Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. Spices, silks, and other valuable goods flowed into Europe, making Portugal incredibly wealthy. The Portuguese built trading posts along the coasts of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, transforming the Indian Ocean into a Portuguese-controlled trading empire. However, it wasn't long before other European nations followed in Portugal's wake. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator funded by Spain, set sail westward with the goal of reaching Asia by an alternative route. Unaware of the existence of the American continents, Columbus believed he could reach the East Indies by crossing the Atlantic Ocean. After weeks of uncertainty and dwindling supplies, his ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, finally sighted land in what is now the Bahamas. Though Columbus never found the riches of Asia, his voyages marked the beginning of sustained contact between Europe and the Americas. Columbus's discovery ignited a wave of Spanish exploration and conquest. Conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro ventured into the Americas, seeking wealth and glory. Cortés famously overthrew the Aztec Empire in 1521, and Pizarro conquered the Inca Empire in 1533, bringing vast territories under Spanish control. The discovery of precious metals in the Americas, especially silver from mines like Potosi in present-day Bolivia, made Spain one of the wealthiest nations in Europe. Spanish galleons, loaded with silver, sailed across the Atlantic, fueling the European economy and financing Spain's dominance in global affairs. The age of exploration was also marked by scientific and technological advancements in navigation and cartography. As European sailors ventured farther into uncharted waters, they began to understand more about the Earth's geography and to improve their maps. This era saw the development of accurate world maps that integrated knowledge from explorers, cartographers, and navigators. The Italian cartographer Gerardus Mercator developed a revolutionary map projection that allowed sailors to plot straight-line courses, making navigation more practical for long-distance voyages. Mercator's projection would become essential for future explorers and remains influential in cartography today. The age of exploration's legacy is not without controversy. While it opened up new trade routes, knowledge, and connections, it also led to the brutal colonization of indigenous populations in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. European powers often viewed the lands they encountered as resources to be exploited, with little regard for the people already living there. Entire civilizations were disrupted or destroyed, their cultures, languages, and ways of life forever altered. European diseases like smallpox decimated indigenous populations, who had no immunity to these new illnesses. In the Americas alone, it's estimated that millions of native people perished due to the combination of disease, warfare, and enslavement. As European empires expanded, they established a complex system of transatlantic trade that included the exchange of goods, people, and ideas. The so-called Columbian Exchange introduced new crops and animals to both the Old World and the New. European settlers brought wheat, cattle, and horses to the Americas, while crops like potatoes, tomatoes, and maize were introduced to Europe. These exchanges transformed diets and agricultural practices on both sides of the Atlantic. The potato, for example, would become a staple crop in Europe, fueling population growth and altering the continent's agricultural landscape. However, the Columbian Exchange also brought the tragic expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. European colonizers relied on enslaved labor to work plantations in the Americas, particularly for sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The demand for labor led to the forced transportation of millions of African men, women, and children across the Atlantic in horrific conditions. The Middle Passage, as this journey was called, was marked by unimaginable suffering, with enslaved people packed tightly into ships, enduring hunger, disease, and abuse. Those who survived were sold into a lifetime of slavery, their labor generating immense wealth for European powers at the cost of human dignity and freedom. Despite the era's darker aspects, the age of exploration transformed the world in fundamental ways. It connected distant continents, creating the first truly global economy and laying the groundwork for modern globalization. European powers established colonies across the Americas, Africa, and Asia, setting off centuries of cultural exchange, conflict, and colonization. The spread of ideas, goods, and technologies between continents reshaped societies around the world, leaving a legacy that is still felt today. Our journey into the past now brings us to one of the most transformative periods in human history, the scientific revolution. Spanning the 16th and 17th centuries, this era saw the birth of modern science, as scholars, philosophers, and inventors began to question traditional beliefs, conduct rigorous experiments, and seek empirical evidence to understand the natural world. It was a time when humanity, for the first time, systematically challenged the ancient dogmas that had shaped human thought for millennia. The scientific revolution laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of physics, astronomy, biology, chemistry, and mathematics, disciplines that would reshape not only scientific thought but every facet of human life. The roots of the scientific revolution lay partly in the Renaissance, a time when European scholars rediscovered the works of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, including Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen. However, while the Renaissance revered ancient wisdom, the scientific revolution challenged it. Scholars began to realize that many of the accepted theories of the ancient world did not hold up under close observation and experimentation. The Renaissance emphasis on questioning authority and exploring new ideas encouraged this shift towards scientific inquiry, fostering an environment where thinkers felt empowered to pursue knowledge independently of tradition. One of the first great minds to challenge the established view of the cosmos was Nicholas Copernicus, a Polish astronomer and mathematician. Until Copernicus's time, the dominant view in Europe was the geocentric model of the universe, which held that the Earth was the center of the cosmos and that all heavenly bodies revolved around it. This view, based on the teachings of the ancient Greek astronomer Ptolemy, was supported by the Catholic Church and had gone unquestioned for over 1,000 years. However, Copernicus's observations led him to propose a radically different model, the heliocentric theory. According to Copernicus, it was the Sun, not the Earth, that lay at the center of the universe, with the planets, including Earth, orbiting around it. Copernicus's heliocentric theory was a revolutionary idea, but it was not immediately accepted. The Church saw it as a challenge to its authority, as the geocentric model was deeply embedded in theological beliefs. However, Copernicus's work inspired other astronomers to investigate his claims, leading to a series of discoveries that would transform astronomy. Among those who followed in Copernicus's footsteps were Johannes Kepler and Galileo Galilei, two of the most influential scientists of the scientific revolution. Kepler, a German mathematician and astronomer, built upon Copernicus's work by introducing the concept of elliptical orbits. Using precise mathematical calculations, Kepler demonstrated that planets do not orbit the Sun in perfect circles, as previously thought, but in ellipses. His laws of planetary motion provided a mathematical foundation for the heliocentric model and showed that the universe operated according to consistent, measurable principles. Kepler's work illustrated the power of mathematics in describing natural phenomena, a concept that would become central to the scientific method. While Kepler advanced the mathematical basis for the heliocentric model, it was Galileo Galilei who provided the observational evidence that would shake the foundations of European thought. An Italian physicist, mathematician, and astronomer, Galileo is often regarded as the father of observational astronomy. In 1609, Galileo built one of the earliest telescopes, which he used to make groundbreaking observations of the night sky. Through his telescope, Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the rough, mountainous surface of the Moon, findings that directly contradicted the prevailing beliefs that heavenly bodies were perfect and immutable. Galileo's discoveries lent powerful support to the heliocentric theory, but they also brought him into direct conflict with the Catholic Church. The Church accused Galileo of heresy for advocating the heliocentric model, which they saw as contrary to biblical teachings. In 1633, he was tried by the Inquisition, forced to recant his views, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Despite his personal suffering, Galileo's work marked a turning point in the scientific revolution, illustrating the tension between science and religious authority and highlighting the determination of scientists to pursue knowledge in the face of opposition. The advancements in astronomy were paralleled by revolutionary developments in physics and mechanics, thanks in large part to the work of Sir Isaac Newton. Born in England in 1643, Newton was a mathematician, physicist, and astronomer whose discoveries would forever change the way humanity understood the natural world. Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, introduced his three laws of motion and the universal law of gravitation. Newton proposed that gravity was the force that governed the motion of objects on Earth and in space, a unifying principle that explained the movement of planets and the behavior of falling objects alike. Newton's laws provided a mathematical framework that described the motion of objects with unprecedented precision, laying the foundation for classical mechanics. His work showed that the universe operated according to consistent, predictable laws, which could be understood through observation, experimentation, and mathematical reasoning. Newton's theories marked the culmination of the scientific revolution, demonstrating the power of science to explain natural phenomena and setting the stage for the Enlightenment and the subsequent Industrial Revolution. The scientific revolution was not limited to astronomy and physics. It also transformed fields like biology and chemistry. In biology, the English physician William Harvey made significant advances in understanding human anatomy and physiology. Through careful dissection and observation, Harvey discovered the principles of blood circulation, challenging the long-held theories of Galen, an ancient Greek physician. Harvey's work on the circulatory system laid the groundwork for modern medicine, emphasizing the importance of empirical evidence and experimentation in understanding the human body. In chemistry, the scientific revolution marked the beginning of a shift from alchemy to modern chemistry. Alchemists had long sought to transform base metals into gold and discover the elixir of life, a quest that often involved mystical and speculative practices. However, scientists like Robert Boyle began to approach chemistry with a more systematic and empirical approach. Boyle's work led to the development of the modern concept of elements and compounds, and his experiments with gases laid the foundation for Boyle's law, which describes the relationship between pressure and volume in gases. Boyle's contributions helped to transform chemistry into a rigorous science, focused on understanding the properties and interactions of matter. Our journey through history now brings us to the Enlightenment, an era that forever changed how societies view reason, individual rights, and governance. Lasting from the late 17th century to the 18th century, the Enlightenment was a time of intellectual fervor that challenged traditional authority, religious dogma, and social hierarchies. Fueled by the scientific revolution's emphasis on rational thought and empirical evidence, Enlightenment thinkers aimed to apply reason to every aspect of human life: politics, economics, education, and personal liberty. The movement laid the philosophical foundations of modern democracy, inspiring revolutions and reshaping society's core values. At the heart of the Enlightenment was the belief in reason as the ultimate tool for human advancement. Thinkers of this era argued that humanity could achieve moral and social progress by using logic and evidence to evaluate ideas, rather than accepting doctrines handed down by tradition or authority. This confidence in reason drove Enlightenment thinkers, or philosophes, to question centuries-old institutions and social norms. They sought to apply rational thought to the human condition, advocating for reforms that would elevate the well-being of individuals and society. One of the most influential figures of the Enlightenment was John Locke, an English philosopher whose ideas about human rights and government profoundly impacted the course of modern political thought. In his seminal work, Two Treatises of Government, published in 1689, Locke argued that all people possess natural rights to life, liberty, and property. He proposed that governments exist only by the consent of the governed and that their primary role is to protect these natural rights. Locke's ideas directly opposed the belief in the divine right of kings, a concept that had justified absolute monarchy for centuries. Instead, he introduced the radical notion that the people have the right to overthrow a government that fails to serve their interests. Locke's emphasis on natural rights and government by consent influenced other Enlightenment thinkers and inspired future democratic movements, including the American Revolution. In the American colonies, Locke's ideas were championed by figures like Thomas Jefferson, who would go on to enshrine them in the Declaration of Independence, asserting the right of the American people to establish their own government based on the principles of liberty and equality. As Enlightenment ideas spread across Europe and beyond, other prominent philosophers added their voices to the call for reform. In France, Voltaire, one of the most famous philosophes, used his sharp wit and writing to criticize the excesses of the French monarchy and the Catholic Church. A fierce advocate for freedom of speech and religious tolerance, Voltaire's works, such as Candide, satirized society's injustices and promoted the idea that individuals should be free to express their thoughts without fear of censorship or persecution. His advocacy for civil liberties would later influence both the American and French revolutions, helping to shape the modern conception of human rights. Another key thinker of the Enlightenment was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose ideas about human nature and government had a profound impact on political theory. In his book The Social Contract, published in 1762, Rousseau introduced the concept of the general will, arguing that a legitimate government should represent the collective will of the people. Unlike Locke, who emphasized individual rights, Rousseau focused on the importance of the community and believed that true freedom could only be achieved by aligning individual interests with the common good. He argued that in an ideal society, laws should be created by the people for the people, reflecting their collective needs and desires. This concept of popular sovereignty would later influence democratic ideologies around the world. Rousseau's ideas extended beyond politics, influencing education and philosophy. In his work Emile, Rousseau advocated for an education system that respects a child's natural development, promoting curiosity and self-discovery rather than rote memorization and strict discipline. His thoughts on education inspired a more holistic view of learning, emphasizing personal growth and emotional well-being alongside academic achievement. This approach would later influence educational reformers and is still seen in modern teaching practices that prioritize a child-centered approach. While the Enlightenment was a period of great intellectual progress, it was also marked by significant contradictions. Many Enlightenment thinkers promoted ideals of liberty and equality, yet they often ignored or rationalized the existence of slavery and colonial exploitation. Figures like Locke and Voltaire criticized social inequality in Europe, but they did not universally apply these principles to all human beings, particularly people of African descent or indigenous populations. These contradictions highlight the complexity of the Enlightenment, an era that advanced human rights and rational thought while simultaneously overlooking profound social injustices. One area where Enlightenment ideals clashed dramatically with reality was in the institution of slavery. As European nations expanded their colonial empires, they relied heavily on enslaved labor, particularly in the Americas. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire criticized the cruelty of slavery, but their calls for reform were often limited to Europe, ignoring the widespread suffering of enslaved people in the colonies. However, some abolitionists, inspired by Enlightenment ideals of human dignity and natural rights, began to argue against slavery. Figures like Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved African, used their writings to expose the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, appealing to Enlightenment values to make the case for abolition. The tension between Enlightenment ideals and colonial practices also extended to indigenous populations in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. Enlightenment thinkers often viewed these societies through a lens of cultural superiority, considering them primitive compared to European civilization. This mindset provided a moral justification for colonialism, as Europeans believed they were bringing progress and enlightenment to lesser cultures. However, these colonial policies often led to the exploitation, displacement, and cultural erasure of indigenous peoples. While the Enlightenment brought significant advancements in human rights, its legacy is complicated by the impact of colonialism on marginalized communities around the world. Another important theme of the Enlightenment was the role of women in society. While most Enlightenment thinkers focused on the rights of men, some advocates began to question the limitations placed on women's freedom and education. Mary Wollstonecraft, an English writer and philosopher, became one of the earliest voices for women's rights. In her groundbreaking work A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, Wollstonecraft argued that women should have access to the same education and opportunities as men. She challenged the prevailing notion that women were naturally inferior and asserted that women's perceived inferiority was the result of limited education and social expectations. Wollstonecraft's ideas laid the foundation for future feminist movements, making her a pioneering figure in the struggle for gender equality. The Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and empirical evidence also extended to science, where figures like Carl Linnaeus, Antoine Lavoisier, and Benjamin Franklin made significant contributions. Linnaeus, a Swedish botanist, developed a system for classifying plants and animals, establishing a scientific framework that allowed for a systematic study of nature. Lavoisier, a French chemist, identified and named oxygen, revolutionizing chemistry and challenging the ancient theory of the four elements. Franklin, an American polymath, conducted groundbreaking experiments with electricity, demonstrating that lightning is an electrical phenomenon. These scientific advancements continued the work of the scientific revolution, expanding humanity's understanding of the natural world and providing practical knowledge that would fuel future progress. As the Enlightenment unfolded, it inspired political revolutions that would transform societies around the globe. In 1776, the American colonies declared their independence from Britain, grounding their new government in Enlightenment principles of natural rights, liberty, and self-governance. The American Revolution inspired the French Revolution, which began in 1789 as French citizens demanded liberty, equality, and fraternity. The French Revolution sought to overthrow the monarchy and establish a republic based on democratic ideals, though it ultimately descended into violence and chaos. Despite the revolution's turbulent nature, it spread Enlightenment ideas across Europe, influencing political movements that sought to challenge oppressive regimes and advocate for popular sovereignty. The Enlightenment's impact on political thought extended beyond Europe and America, influencing movements in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Leaders like Simón Bolívar, who fought for independence in South America, were inspired by Enlightenment ideals, seeking to establish new nations free from colonial rule. The spread of Enlightenment thought encouraged people worldwide to question authority, challenge oppression, and envision societies based on justice and human rights. The legacy of the Enlightenment is complex, as its ideals were not always fully realized or applied universally. Yet, the Enlightenment planted the seeds for many of the democratic principles and values we hold today. The era's emphasis on reason, individual rights, and social reform laid the foundations for modern democracy, human rights, and scientific progress. The Enlightenment demonstrated the power of ideas to shape society, inspiring generations of thinkers, activists, and reformers who sought to build a more just and enlightened world. In the Enlightenment, we see both the triumph of reason and the limitations of human progress. It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge and justice is an ongoing journey, one that requires not only intellectual courage, but a commitment to addressing the inequalities and injustices that persist in every era. The ideals of the Enlightenment continue to inspire us, urging us to seek truth, uphold human dignity, and strive for a society where liberty, equality, and reason prevail. As we conclude this scene, we reflect on the enduring impact of the Enlightenment, a period that challenged humanity to think critically, question deeply, and dream of a world where all people can pursue knowledge and freedom. Though the Enlightenment's work remains unfinished, its legacy lives on in our ongoing efforts to build a fairer, wiser, and more inclusive world. As we step forward in time, we enter the 18th and 19th centuries, a period marked by one of the most transformative developments in human history, the Industrial Revolution. This era was characterized by unprecedented advancements in technology, a shift from agrarian economies to industrial powerhouses, and profound changes in society's structure and daily life. From the steam engines powering factories and locomotives to the invention of machinery that could mass-produce goods, the Industrial Revolution reshaped nearly every aspect of human life. But while this period brought about immense progress, it also led to stark inequalities, environmental degradation, and new challenges that would define modern societies. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain around 1760 and spread across Europe, the United States, and eventually much of the world. This transformation was driven by a combination of technological innovation, the rise of capitalism, and access to natural resources like coal and iron. At the heart of this revolution were several groundbreaking inventions and processes that altered production, transportation, and communication. Machines like the spinning jenny, the power loom, and the steam engine mechanized tasks that had previously been performed by hand, allowing goods to be produced on a massive scale. For the first time in history, factories became the epicenters of production, drawing thousands of people into urban areas and giving rise to new economic systems. The spinning jenny, invented by James Hargreaves in 1764, revolutionized textile production by allowing a single worker to spin multiple threads simultaneously. This invention was followed by the development of the power loom by Edmund Cartwright in the 1780s, which automated the weaving process and significantly increased the speed of textile manufacturing. With these innovations, textile production moved from small-scale, home-based operations to large factories, where hundreds of workers could operate machines under one roof. The textile industry became the driving force of the Industrial Revolution, fueling economic growth and creating immense wealth for factory owners. Another pivotal invention was the steam engine, perfected by James Watt in the 1770s. The steam engine provided a reliable and powerful source of energy that was not dependent on natural forces like wind or water. This invention powered factories, mills, and eventually trains and ships, revolutionizing both industry and transportation. Railroads emerged as a new mode of transportation, connecting cities and facilitating the movement of goods and people over long distances. By the early 19th century, rail networks had spread across Britain and into continental Europe and the United States, transforming travel and commerce. Goods could now be transported quickly and cheaply, allowing businesses to expand their markets and creating a new era of global trade. While the Industrial Revolution spurred economic growth and technological progress, it also had profound social impacts. As factories multiplied, millions of people moved from rural areas to rapidly growing cities in search of work. This urban migration led to the rise of new industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool in Britain, which became centers of manufacturing and commerce. However, life in these cities was often harsh and unforgiving. Factory workers, including men, women, and even children, labored long hours in hazardous conditions, with little regard for their health and safety. The average workday could stretch to 12 or even 16 hours, and wages were barely enough to survive. Living conditions in industrial cities were often squalid and overcrowded. Workers and their families lived in cramped, poorly constructed housing near factories, where sanitation was minimal, and diseases like cholera and tuberculosis spread rapidly. Air pollution from coal-powered factories filled the skies, creating a permanent haze over cities and causing respiratory illnesses. The industrial landscape was one of stark contrasts, with immense wealth generated by factory owners and investors, while the working class faced grinding poverty and exploitation. This divide between the wealthy industrialists and the impoverished workers became one of the defining social issues of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution also gave rise to new social classes and altered the structure of society. The traditional agrarian society, where most people lived as farmers or artisans, was replaced by a new social order dominated by industrial capitalists and factory workers. At the top were the industrialists and entrepreneurs who amassed great fortunes by owning factories and controlling production. Below them was the emerging middle class of professionals, such as engineers, managers, and clerks, who enjoyed a modest level of wealth and social mobility. At the bottom was the working class, whose labor fueled the industrial economy but who had little power or representation. The plight of the working class did not go unnoticed. Social reformers and political thinkers began to criticize the harsh conditions faced by factory workers and called for change. One of the most influential critics of industrial capitalism was Karl Marx, a German philosopher and economist who, along with Friedrich Engels, published the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Marx argued that the capitalist system exploited workers by treating them as commodities and profiting from their labor without fairly compensating them. He predicted that this exploitation would lead to class struggle between the proletariat, or working class, and the bourgeoisie, or capitalist class, ultimately resulting in a revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system. Marx's ideas would later inspire socialist and communist movements around the world, shaping the political landscape of the 20th century. Alongside the rise of socialist ideas, the Industrial Revolution also sparked various social reforms aimed at improving workers' lives. Reformers pushed for labor laws to limit working hours, establish minimum wages, and regulate child labor. The British Parliament passed several Factory Acts during the 19th century, which gradually improved working conditions by restricting child labor, mandating safety measures, and reducing the maximum workday for women and children. These reforms marked the beginning of labor rights and set the stage for the modern welfare state, where governments took an active role in protecting workers and addressing social inequalities. The impact of the Industrial Revolution was not confined to Europe and the United States. As industrialization spread, it reshaped economies and societies around the globe. Countries like Germany and Japan rapidly industrialized, using government policies to promote industry and infrastructure. In colonial regions, however, the effects of industrialization were often exploitative. European powers extracted raw materials from their colonies to fuel their factories, disrupting traditional economies and creating dependency. This unequal relationship between industrialized nations and their colonies laid the groundwork for economic imbalances that persist to this day. The Industrial Revolution also had a lasting impact on the environment. The rapid expansion of factories and the increased use of coal led to deforestation, pollution, and a significant rise in greenhouse gas emissions. Industrial cities became polluted hubs, with toxic air, contaminated water, and waste disposal issues. These environmental consequences were largely ignored during the 19th century, but they would become a growing concern in the 20th century as awareness of industrial pollution and climate change increased. In addition to its environmental impact, the Industrial Revolution transformed global trade and consumption. With the ability to mass-produce goods, industries began to manufacture consumer products like clothing, household items, and even luxury goods at lower costs, making them accessible to a wider audience. This shift gave rise to a consumer culture, where people increasingly defined themselves by what they could buy. Advertising and marketing became powerful tools, shaping desires and creating new markets for goods. This culture of consumption, fueled by industrial production, laid the foundation for the consumer economies of the 20th and 21st centuries. The technological innovations of the Industrial Revolution extended beyond factories and production. Communication also evolved, with the invention of the telegraph in the 1830s revolutionizing the way information was transmitted. Developed by Samuel Morse and others, the telegraph allowed messages to be sent over long distances almost instantly, connecting people and businesses like never before. This breakthrough in communication facilitated global trade, enabled faster decision-making, and marked the beginning of a connected world, a precursor to the modern era of digital communication. The Industrial Revolution was not merely an economic transformation, it was a cultural shift that redefined human life, work, and society. It sparked debates about labor rights, economic inequality, and the role of government in regulating industry, debates that continue to shape our world today. The era's legacy is complex, marked by both extraordinary progress and significant challenges. While the Industrial Revolution brought material wealth and technological advancements, it also highlighted the costs of unchecked industrial growth, from social injustice to environmental degradation. As we reflect on the Industrial Revolution, we see a period of extraordinary change that propelled humanity into the modern age. It reminds us of the potential for innovation to transform societies, but also of the importance of addressing the social and environmental consequences of progress. The lessons of the Industrial Revolution continue to resonate, urging us to consider how we can create a more just, sustainable, and equitable world as we move forward in our own era of technological change. Following the industrial advancements of the 18th and 19th centuries, the world entered an age of imperialism, a period marked by the aggressive expansion of European powers into Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. From the late 1800s to the early 20th century, European nations, along with Japan and the United States, competed to acquire colonies, seeking new territories and resources to fuel their growing industrial economies. This era, known as the Age of Imperialism, reshaped the global landscape, drawing sharp lines of division and power that left a lasting legacy of both progress and hardship. Driven by a combination of economic interests, political rivalry, and a belief in racial and cultural superiority, the imperial powers carved out vast empires, fundamentally altering the lives of millions. By the dawn of the 20th century, almost all of Africa and large parts of Asia were under foreign rule, as imperial nations imposed their economic and political structures, often at the expense of local cultures and societies. To fully understand this period, we must explore the motivations behind imperialism, the mechanisms through which it was enforced, and the profound impacts it had on both the colonizers and the colonized. The roots of imperialism lie in the economic transformations brought about by the Industrial Revolution. As factories and industries grew in Europe, so did the demand for raw materials like rubber, oil, metals, and other resources essential for production. European nations found themselves in fierce competition for access to these materials, which they increasingly sought in foreign lands. Colonies offered not only raw materials but also new markets to sell manufactured goods, creating a mutually reinforcing cycle of exploitation. By controlling territories rich in resources, European powers could secure a steady supply for their industries and guarantee markets for their exports. However, economic motives alone did not drive imperialism. Nationalism, the belief in the superiority of one's nation and the desire to expand its power, also played a significant role. During the 19th century, European countries, particularly Britain, France, and Germany, engaged in a political race to build the largest empires. This competition was fueled by a desire for prestige and dominance, as each nation sought to prove its power on the world stage. The acquisition of colonies became a status symbol, a testament to a nation's strength and influence. As European nations amassed empires, they justified their actions through the idea of the civilizing mission, the belief that it was their duty to spread Western civilization, religion, and values to backward societies. This sense of cultural superiority was underpinned by a set of beliefs known as social Darwinism. Influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, social Darwinism held that certain races and societies were naturally superior to others, and that the fittest civilizations had a right, even an obligation, to dominate weaker ones. This pseudoscientific justification was used to legitimize the brutal policies of conquest and exploitation. European powers claimed they were bringing civilization to Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world, disregarding the complex cultures and societies that had existed there for centuries. One of the most striking examples of imperial expansion was the scramble for Africa, a rapid colonization of the African continent by European powers in the late 19th century. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European nations, without any African representatives present, divided Africa among themselves, drawing artificial borders that disregarded ethnic and cultural boundaries. France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, and other European countries established colonies across Africa, imposing their control over vast territories and exploiting the continent's resources and people. In a matter of years, nearly all of Africa fell under European rule, leading to profound economic and social disruptions. The impact of imperialism on African societies was severe. Colonizers established systems of forced labor, compelling African populations to work on plantations, mines, and infrastructure projects under harsh and often deadly conditions. The extraction of resources enriched European economies but brought devastation to local communities. Traditional ways of life were disrupted, as colonizers imposed their languages, laws, and religions, undermining indigenous cultures. In many cases, colonial authorities used violence and coercion to suppress resistance, leading to brutal conflicts and uprisings. The consequences of these policies continue to resonate in the political and social challenges faced by many African nations today. In Asia, imperialism took on different forms but was no less impactful. The British East India Company, for instance, played a central role in the colonization of India. Starting as a trading company, it gradually expanded its control through both diplomacy and military force, eventually ruling over large parts of the Indian subcontinent. By the mid-19th century, Britain officially made India a colony, establishing the British Raj. India became known as the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, a vital source of wealth and resources, including textiles, tea, and spices. However, British policies also led to economic dependency, with India's economy becoming structured to serve British interests, often at the expense of local industries and livelihoods. In addition to economic exploitation, British rule in India introduced social and cultural changes. British officials promoted Western education, law, and political structures, which had mixed effects on Indian society. While some Indians benefited from access to education and government positions, British policies also deepened social inequalities and created divisions. The Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, a major uprising against British rule, highlighted the resentment and resistance to colonial policies. Though ultimately suppressed, the rebellion became a symbol of Indian resistance and a precursor to the broader independence movement that would emerge in the 20th century. Imperialism extended beyond Africa and Asia, reaching the Pacific and the Americas. The United States, after consolidating its own territory, pursued an imperialist policy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marked a turning point, as the U.S. gained control of former Spanish colonies, including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Like their European counterparts, American leaders justified imperialism as a civilizing mission, though economic interests and strategic considerations were central to their policies. The annexation of Hawaii and the construction of the Panama Canal further demonstrated America's growing influence and ambition as a global power. Japan, too, became an imperial power during this period. Following its rapid modernization in the late 19th century, Japan sought to expand its influence in East Asia, engaging in conflicts with China and Russia and ultimately establishing control over Korea and parts of Manchuria. Japanese imperialism was marked by its own version of racial superiority and a desire to establish dominance in Asia. The expansionist policies of Japan set the stage for future conflicts, particularly in the lead-up to World War II. While imperialism enriched European economies and accelerated technological progress, it also created deep-seated grievances and divisions. In many cases, the artificial borders drawn by imperial powers ignored ethnic, linguistic, and cultural differences, leading to conflicts that persist to this day. The imposition of foreign rule disrupted traditional governance structures, eroded local economies, and undermined indigenous identities. The legacy of imperialism remains a complex and often painful part of history, shaping the post-colonial world in ways that are still felt today. The age of imperialism also set the stage for nationalist movements across the colonized world. As education spread and colonial subjects gained exposure to Western ideas of democracy and rights, demands for independence grew. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi in India, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya became symbols of resistance against colonial rule, advocating for self-determination and national identity. These movements would gain momentum in the 20th century, ultimately leading to decolonization and the end of European empires. Despite the end of formal colonialism, the legacies of imperialism continue to influence global politics, economics, and culture. Former colonies often struggle with political instability, economic dependency, and social divisions rooted in their colonial past. The economic exploitation and extraction of resources during the colonial era left many regions impoverished and dependent on global markets. Moreover, the cultural and linguistic influences of colonialism remain visible, as former colonies navigate the complex task of reconciling their indigenous identities with the legacy of Western influence. In retrospect, the age of imperialism was a time of extraordinary expansion and profound consequence. It was an era that saw both remarkable advancements and deep moral contradictions, as the pursuit of power and wealth came at a great human cost. The narratives of progress and civilization that justified imperialism now appear hollow in light of the suffering inflicted on countless societies. Yet, the stories of resilience and resistance from the colonized people remind us of the enduring human spirit and the unyielding desire for freedom and self-determination. As we close the scene, we leave the age of imperialism with a complex understanding of its impacts and legacies. It was a time when ambition and exploitation coexisted, where progress came hand in hand with oppression, and where the foundations of the modern world were laid, both for better and for worse. As the age of imperialism waned, a powerful new force began to shape the global landscape: nationalism. Born from the desire for self-determination and fueled by years of exploitation under colonial rule, nationalism inspired millions in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas to seek independence from foreign powers. This movement was not merely a political struggle, it was a deeply personal one, a reclamation of identity, culture, and autonomy. Nationalism was not entirely new. In Europe, it had already played a central role in shaping modern nation-states. But in colonized regions, nationalism took on unique characteristics. It was often intertwined with anti-colonial sentiments, economic frustrations, and cultural revival. This form of nationalism rejected the idea of subordination to a foreign power and instead promoted pride in indigenous identities and histories. For many, it was a reaction against the dehumanizing effects of colonial rule, where cultural erasure and economic exploitation were common. Independence became not only a political goal but a moral imperative, a matter of dignity and justice. The Indian independence movement, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, was one of the most influential examples of anti-colonial nationalism. India's long struggle against British rule became a model for other colonies. The movement was unique for its strategy of nonviolent resistance, which Gandhi championed as a means to counteract the violence of colonialism without replicating it. Through boycotts, protests, and civil disobedience, Gandhi and his followers sought to disrupt British control in a way that was morally unassailable, building a sense of solidarity across India's diverse population. The Salt March of 1930, where Gandhi and thousands of followers marched 240 miles to protest the British monopoly on salt, became a symbol of defiance. The movement resonated globally, inspiring anti-colonial efforts in Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond. Across the continent of Africa, anti-colonial nationalism emerged in the wake of the Second World War, as European powers, weakened by the conflict, struggled to maintain control over their colonies. African leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Patrice Lumumba in the Congo became symbols of the continent's fight for liberation. Nkrumah, who led Ghana to independence in 1957, envisioned a united Africa freed from colonial chains. He understood that independence was more than a political act, it was a restoration of African pride and identity. Nkrumah's Pan-African vision inspired leaders across the continent, sparking a wave of decolonization that would reshape Africa within a generation. In Southeast Asia, the end of World War II marked the beginning of fierce independence struggles. In Vietnam, nationalist leader Ho Chi Minh declared independence from France in 1945, igniting a conflict that would last until the mid-20th century. Ho Chi Minh's movement combined nationalism with communist ideology, positioning Vietnam's struggle within a broader fight against imperialism and capitalism. The ensuing conflict, known as the First Indochina War, would eventually lead to a divided Vietnam and later, the Vietnam War, a testament to the geopolitical complexities that often accompanied independence movements during the Cold War. In Indonesia, nationalist leader Sukarno declared independence from the Netherlands in 1945. Although the Dutch attempted to regain control, Indonesia's nationalists resisted fiercely, leading to a bloody 4-year war. The Indonesian struggle was significant not only for its intensity but also for its implications on the global stage, as a demonstration that colonial powers could no longer easily impose their will on a mobilized, nationalist population. In 1949, Indonesia achieved full independence, marking a major victory for Southeast Asian nationalism and inspiring movements in neighboring countries. The Middle East, too, became a hotbed of nationalist fervor as countries sought to end foreign domination. In Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser emerged as a powerful nationalist leader in the 1950s, advocating for both Egyptian sovereignty and pan-Arab unity. Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal in 1956 became a defining moment of resistance against European control, as he wrested one of the world's most strategic waterways from British and French influence. Nasser's bold move inspired Arab nationalism across the Middle East, contributing to a regional shift towards self-governance and the rejection of Western interference. However, the road to independence was not always smooth. In many cases, the departure of colonial powers left behind economic instability, ethnic tensions, and political divisions. Colonial rule had often drawn artificial borders that disregarded local identities and rivalries, creating fault lines that would later lead to conflicts. The partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 serves as a tragic example. As British rule ended, religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims erupted, resulting in widespread violence and the displacement of millions. The division of the subcontinent left a legacy of animosity between India and Pakistan, shaping geopolitics in South Asia for decades to come. In Africa, the decolonization process also revealed the lingering impact of colonial policies. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers had forced together diverse ethnic groups, leading to conflicts that would later erupt into civil wars. In Algeria, the struggle for independence from France was especially brutal, as the French military fought to retain control of its colony. The Algerian War, which lasted from 1954 to 1962, involved widespread violence and atrocities, symbolizing the fierce resistance colonized people were willing to mount to achieve self-determination. Algeria's eventual victory became a powerful symbol for anti-colonial movements worldwide, proving that even the most entrenched colonial regimes could be overthrown. As these nations gained independence, they faced the daunting task of building new political and economic systems. For many, this period became a double-edged sword. The freedom they had fought for came with the challenges of development and modernization. Newly independent states often struggled with poverty, illiteracy, and a lack of infrastructure, problems compounded by the economic structures left by colonial rule. Former colonial powers had designed economies to serve their interests, focusing on resource extraction rather than local development. This left many post-colonial nations dependent on foreign aid and vulnerable to global market fluctuations. Furthermore, the Cold War added a new layer of complexity to the independence movements. Both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to influence newly independent states, viewing them as strategic assets in the global struggle between capitalism and communism. This geopolitical rivalry often led to proxy wars and internal conflicts, as external powers provided support to factions aligned with their interests. In Angola, for example, independence from Portugal in 1975 was followed by a prolonged civil war fueled by Cold War allegiances, with the United States and Soviet Union supporting opposing sides. In these ways, the aspirations for self-determination and peace were often complicated by the realities of global politics. As the 20th century progressed, the wave of decolonization continued, with the final vestiges of European empires dissolving. The dismantling of colonial rule did not end the challenges for former colonies, but it marked a significant step toward a world where all people could aspire to govern themselves. Nationalism had become a force that could not be ignored, a driving principle that reshaped borders, governments, and societies. The stories of these independence movements remain powerful reminders of the human spirit's resilience and the universal yearning for freedom. Today, the legacy of nationalism and the struggle for independence is visible in the post-colonial world. Former colonies, despite their challenges, have taken strides toward economic development, cultural revival, and political stability. The pride and identity forged during these struggles continue to influence national narratives and aspirations. The leaders of independence movements are celebrated as heroes, their sacrifices commemorated in national holidays, statues, and public memory. Independence, however, is not merely a historical milestone, it is an ongoing journey, as nations seek to overcome past injustices, foster unity, and build a future that honors their cultural heritage and aspirations. Reflecting on this period, we see that the rise of nationalism was not simply a rejection of colonial rule but a profound reimagining of what it meant to belong to a community, to have a shared history, and to be part of a sovereign nation. The movements that emerged during this era laid the foundations for modern nation-states, challenging the dominance of imperial powers and contributing to a more pluralistic and diverse world order. Nationalism, though sometimes a source of division, also became a force for unity and resilience, a testament to the enduring quest for self-determination and identity in a rapidly changing world. And thus, the world moved forward, forever transformed by the waves of independence that reshaped entire continents. The nationalist movements of the 20th century remind us that freedom, once kindled, can never be easily extinguished. It is a flame that, once ignited, spreads and grows, burning brightly in the hearts of those who believe that a nation's destiny should be its own to shape. The legacy of this era is one of courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit, a legacy that continues to inspire those who seek justice, equality, and independence in all corners of the globe. As we move deeper into the story of decolonization, we begin to see that the end of imperial rule did not mean the end of struggles for the newly independent nations. While liberation from colonial powers was a victory, it often came with complex, long-lasting challenges. Decolonization was only the first step in a new chapter that would be defined by efforts to build sustainable, equitable, and stable societies in regions profoundly altered by colonial rule. The road forward was filled with economic challenges, political instability, and social upheaval, as post-colonial nations grappled with the legacy left by centuries of foreign control. Economically, colonial powers had often left their former colonies dependent on a single industry or resource, exploiting natural wealth for their own benefit and hindering local development. In many African nations, for example, economies were built around mining and agriculture, producing raw materials like gold, diamonds, rubber, or coffee, which were then shipped to Europe or North America. With limited diversification and little industrial infrastructure, newly independent countries found it challenging to compete in the global economy. They were forced to rely on exports of raw materials, leaving them vulnerable to fluctuations in global commodity prices. If the price of coffee, oil, or cocoa dropped, entire economies could suffer, leading to poverty and food insecurity for millions. Countries like Nigeria and Angola, rich in oil, discovered that their resource wealth brought as many problems as it did opportunities. Oil wealth attracted foreign interests, but it also led to corruption and political conflict, as various factions vied for control over lucrative resources. In Nigeria, oil revenues helped fund the government but also fueled tensions between ethnic groups, contributing to the outbreak of civil war in the 1960s. The term resource curse became associated with such economies, where resource abundance paradoxically led to economic hardship, political corruption, and conflict. The struggle to break free from the dependence on natural resources and build diversified, resilient economies remains a central challenge for many post-colonial states today. Political instability was another consequence of the colonial legacy. Colonial borders, often arbitrarily drawn, forced different ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups into single political units. In Africa and the Middle East, this often led to tensions as diverse groups found themselves in competition for power within newly independent states. Colonial authorities had frequently favored one group over others, creating divisions that would become sources of conflict once the colonial administrations departed. In Rwanda, the divisions between the Hutu and Tutsi populations, exacerbated by Belgian colonial policies, led to one of the most devastating genocides in modern history. Across the continent, many post-colonial leaders faced the challenge of creating a sense of national unity among populations that had been intentionally divided by their colonial rulers. In Latin America, the decolonization process was complex and lengthy. Although most countries achieved independence in the 19th century, they continued to experience political and economic interference from foreign powers, especially the United States. The doctrine of manifest destiny and the Monroe Doctrine were used to justify American interventions in Latin America, often to protect U.S. interests and influence. Countries like Nicaragua, Cuba, and Chile saw their governments overthrown or undermined with foreign support. This interference hindered Latin American countries from fully realizing their independence, as they remained economically and politically dominated by external forces. This neocolonialism continues to shape the political landscape of the region, with economic dependence on foreign investments and enduring poverty in many areas. The Cold War added further complexity to the newly independent nation struggles, as the United States and Soviet Union sought to expand their influence in what they saw as an ideological battleground. Many newly decolonized states found themselves pressured to choose between aligning with either the capitalist West or the communist East. In some cases, foreign powers supported authoritarian leaders or rebel groups, destabilizing entire regions. In Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, Cold War dynamics exacerbated local conflicts and led to prolonged civil wars. Angola, for instance, became a battleground for Cold War rivalries, with the United States, the Soviet Union, and Cuba all involved in the country's civil war. This global tug-of-war complicated efforts to establish stable, self-governing democracies, as many countries became pawns in a much larger geopolitical game. Socially, the legacy of colonial rule continued to impact former colonies in profound ways. Many colonial powers had imposed their culture, language, and values on the societies they controlled, leading to cultural dislocation and a sense of inferiority among colonized people. In places like India and much of Africa, English or French became the languages of government, education, and business, even after independence. Indigenous languages and traditions were often marginalized, and many young people felt disconnected from their cultural heritage. This cultural alienation was accompanied by a lack of education and literacy, which colonial administrations had rarely prioritized for indigenous populations. Building educational systems that reflected local languages and cultures became an essential, though difficult, task for post-colonial governments. However, the journey of post-colonial nations is also one of resilience, creativity, and renewal. National leaders, intellectuals, and activists emerged with a vision for a new future, one where former colonies could reclaim their identities and build societies based on their own values. Leaders like Nelson Mandela in South Africa, Leopold Sédar Senghor in Senegal, and Amilcar Cabral in Guinea-Bissau advocated for cultural pride, self-reliance, and Pan-African unity. These figures understood that independence was not just a political reality but a cultural and psychological transformation as well. By promoting African literature, music, and philosophy, they sought to empower their people and rebuild a sense of pride in their heritage. In Southeast Asia, countries like Malaysia and Singapore transformed their economies through industrialization and investment in education, creating prosperity for their citizens and proving that post-colonial nations could compete on the global stage. In Latin America, leaders like Evo Morales in Bolivia and Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil worked to address historical inequalities and empower indigenous and working-class communities. Their leadership reflected a broader trend across the post-colonial world, where marginalized voices began to play a more significant role in shaping national policies. The process of reconciliation with the past has also led to discussions about the meaning of nationalism and identity in post-colonial societies. For many, independence remains an ongoing project, a journey toward true sovereignty that includes economic independence, social justice, and environmental sustainability. Former colonies continue to seek partnerships that respect their autonomy and contribute to their development, challenging the remnants of neocolonialism that persist in trade, finance, and international relations. The story of decolonization is a testament to the power of resilience, solidarity, and the enduring human spirit. From the dusty streets of Delhi to the crowded marketplaces of Lagos, the mountains of Bolivia to the islands of Indonesia, people in former colonies have continued to write their own histories, building on the legacy of independence to create societies that reflect their unique identities and aspirations. While the path forward is complex, it is one defined by the determination to overcome past injustices and build a future where all people can enjoy the dignity, freedom, and opportunity that independence was meant to secure. In reflecting on this journey, we see that the struggle for independence was not only about liberation from colonial powers but also a reclamation of identity, culture, and pride. The narratives of resilience and struggle, hope and renewal that define the post-colonial world remind us that while colonialism left deep scars, it also ignited a desire for self-determination that could not be extinguished. These nations, with their unique histories and diverse cultures, are shaping the 21st century in ways that honor their past and envision a more just, equitable, and inclusive future. The story of decolonization is far from over. It is an ongoing quest for justice, freedom, and the realization of the dreams that inspired generations to fight for independence. As we look at the world today, it's clear that the legacy of decolonization is woven into the fabric of our global society. Former colonies are now leaders in technology, culture, and social change, bringing unique perspectives and solutions to global challenges. They are more than survivors of imperialism. They are innovators, creators, and leaders in a world that has been forever changed by the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to live in subjugation. The story of decolonization continues, a testament to the power of human resilience and the belief that every nation has the right to chart its own course and define its own destiny. The story of decolonization is not only one of national independence and liberation, it's a story that reshaped the world order, permanently altering relationships between nations, influencing international law, and reimagining concepts of human rights, sovereignty, and self-determination. The global impact of decolonization reaches into every corner of our modern world, affecting geopolitics, economic systems, cultural exchanges, and even the ways in which we understand history itself. This transformation has not only left a profound mark on the former colonies but also on former colonial powers, as well as on the interconnected world that emerged after the colonial era. As colonial empires crumbled, a new paradigm of international relations began to take shape. No longer would a handful of European powers dominate global politics and economics. Instead, newly independent nations entered the international arena, joining organizations such as the United Nations, where they collectively wielded influence in numbers. Through alliances like the Non-Aligned Movement, established in 1961, these nations sought to chart a course independent of Cold War pressures. They advocated for peace, sovereignty, and a balanced global order, free from the binary divisions of East and West. Leaders like India's Jawaharlal Nehru, Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito championed this movement, arguing for a third way that would prioritize the needs and interests of developing nations over the agendas of the world's superpowers. The Non-Aligned Movement symbolized a collective stance against neocolonialism, the persistence of foreign influence in the internal affairs of post-colonial nations. It was a rejection of the notion that these newly independent countries would simply become clients or pawns of either the capitalist West or the communist East. Instead, the leaders of the Non-Aligned Movement aspired to create a world where sovereignty was respected, and where developing nations could pursue their own paths to economic and social development. Their vision was revolutionary and ambitious, a world where the global South could build itself up without interference, where economic justice would replace exploitation, and where solidarity among developing nations would allow them to negotiate as equals on the world stage. Despite these ambitions, neocolonialism continued to present challenges for former colonies. Economic dependency, exploitative trade practices, and political interference often kept these nations from achieving the full benefits of independence. International corporations frequently extracted resources and profits from developing countries, leaving little wealth behind. Foreign aid, while sometimes beneficial, also came with strings attached, often requiring recipients to adopt policies that prioritize foreign interests over local needs. Loans from institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank became tools for economic influence, as countries were forced to implement structural adjustment programs that cut social spending, privatized state assets, and opened markets to foreign competition. These policies frequently led to unemployment, poverty, and economic instability, exacerbating the very issues they were intended to resolve. Recognizing the need to assert economic independence, many former colonies experimented with various development strategies. Some pursued socialist models, nationalizing industries and implementing land reforms. Others embraced state-led capitalism, investing in infrastructure, education, and healthcare to build self-sustaining economies. Southeast Asian nations like South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore emerged as Asian tigers, demonstrating that rapid industrialization and export-oriented growth could lift countries out of poverty and transform them into global economic players. In Latin America, leaders like Salvador Allende in Chile sought to redistribute wealth and resources more equitably, though such efforts were often met with fierce resistance from both local elites and foreign powers invested in maintaining the status quo. Culturally, decolonization sparked a powerful movement of self-discovery and pride. Colonized peoples, once taught to view their cultures as inferior, began to reclaim their heritage, celebrate their traditions, and assert their identities on the world stage. Across Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and Latin America, literature, art, and music became tools of resistance, self-expression, and transformation. Writers like Chinua Achebe in Nigeria, Gabriel Garcia Marquez in Colombia, and Ngugi wa Thiong'o in Kenya used their craft to tell stories that reflected the realities of post-colonial life. They explored themes of identity, loss, resilience, and hope, challenging stereotypes and confronting the legacies of colonialism in ways that resonated globally. The concept of Afrofuturism, for example, emerged as a celebration of African heritage while imagining alternative futures free from the constraints of colonialism and oppression. In Latin America, magic realism became a means of blending indigenous cultural narratives with modern storytelling, creating a literary form that celebrated local traditions and histories while addressing universal themes. Meanwhile, across the Caribbean, reggae and calypso music became voices of protest, symbols of resilience, and expressions of cultural pride. These cultural movements were not only artistic, they were political, embodying a refusal to be defined by colonial stereotypes and asserting a new vision for post-colonial societies. As these nations forged their own identities, they also influenced global culture. Today, former colonies contribute to the rich tapestry of global art, music, fashion, and cuisine. The diaspora communities created by the colonial era have introduced diverse cultural practices to places far from their original homelands, creating a global exchange that enriches societies worldwide. In the culinary world, for instance, Indian spices, African ingredients, and Caribbean flavors have become staples in kitchens across Europe and the Americas. The spread of reggae, hip-hop, Bollywood, and Nollywood films reflects the global impact of formerly colonized cultures, reshaping the global cultural landscape in ways that colonial powers could never have anticipated. On the legal and diplomatic fronts, decolonization has reshaped international law. The principle of self-determination, once a radical idea, became enshrined in international law as a fundamental human right. The United Nations adopted resolutions affirming the right of all peoples to determine their political status, a recognition that forced nations to respect the sovereignty of others. The anti-apartheid movement, which culminated in the end of racial segregation in South Africa, further strengthened this principle, as global pressure forced the apartheid regime to dismantle its discriminatory policies. Today, the fight for self-determination continues in various parts of the world, from indigenous movements in North and South America to separatist struggles in regions like Kurdistan and Catalonia. Environmental justice has also become a critical issue in the post-colonial world. Former colonies, particularly in Africa and Latin America, are home to some of the world's most valuable ecosystems, including rainforests, rivers, and coral reefs. These regions often bear the brunt of environmental exploitation, as foreign companies extract resources with little regard for ecological consequences. Deforestation, pollution, and climate change have hit these areas hard, impacting the livelihoods of indigenous communities and threatening biodiversity. In response, post-colonial nations have become leaders in the global environmental movement, advocating for sustainable development, biodiversity conservation, and climate justice. They argue that those who contributed most to environmental degradation, historically, the industrialized nations of the global north, should take responsibility for mitigating its effects and supporting sustainable development in the global south. As we stand in the 21st century, The legacy of decolonization continues to shape our world in both visible and subtle ways. The struggles of former colonies have left an indelible mark on international relations, inspiring movements for social justice, human rights, and equality across the globe. The values of sovereignty, cultural pride, and economic justice that emerged from decolonization resonate with movements that continue to challenge oppression, from the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States to pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. The fight for dignity, respect, and fairness transcends borders, linking people across continents in a shared vision of a more just and equitable world. Today, as we reflect on the journey of decolonization, we recognize that it is not just a historical event, it is an ongoing process. Former colonies are still working to address the economic disparities, political challenges, and social inequalities rooted in colonialism. But they are doing so with a determination to create societies that reflect their values, celebrate their cultures, and protect their resources. They are charting new paths that blend tradition with innovation, self-determination with global collaboration, and economic development with environmental stewardship. The legacy of decolonization teaches us that independence is not merely the absence of foreign rule, it is a continuous process of self-discovery, resilience, and transformation. It is about building a future that honors the past while creating opportunities for generations to come. It reminds us that the world can only thrive when all nations and peoples are free to determine their own destinies, contribute to global progress, and take pride in their unique identities. As we look to the future, the lessons of decolonization remind us of our shared humanity and the importance of standing in solidarity with those who continue to seek justice, freedom, and self-determination. From the rainforests of the Amazon to the deserts of the Sahara, the resilience and creativity of post-colonial nations inspire us to imagine a world where every voice is heard, every culture is celebrated, and every person has the opportunity to build a better future. The story of decolonization is far from over. It lives on in the dreams, struggles, and aspirations of people across the globe, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the human spirit. As the sun set on the colonial era, it gave rise to a new dawn of global politics. The consequences of decolonization went far beyond the political independence of nations. They reverberated through the entire structure of global power. No longer could the world be easily divided into the colonizing powers of Europe and their scattered colonies. The emergence of newly independent nations, with their diverse economic, political, and cultural frameworks, marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in global power dynamics that would continue to evolve throughout the 20th century and beyond. One of the most significant consequences of decolonization was the reconfiguration of the global balance of power. After World War II, the world was already divided into two dominant spheres of influence: the capitalist West, led by the United States, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union. This Cold War rivalry seemed to leave little room for the newly independent nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, many of which had been freed from colonial control during this time. Yet, as they entered the global stage, these nations, initially dismissed by both superpowers as irrelevant to the broader geopolitical struggle, began to reshape the contours of international relations in ways that would have lasting effects. The United Nations, established in 1945, became a crucial arena for these newly independent nations to assert themselves. At the time of its founding, the UN had only 51 member states. By the 1960s, the number had swollen to over 100, many of them newly independent nations. This influx gave voice to countries that had previously been marginalized, and their collective presence, though not always cohesive, was powerful. It was in the UN that the principle of self-determination, which had been so central to the decolonization movement, found a legal and diplomatic foundation. Resolutions such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, and various UN resolutions against colonialism and racial discrimination, reflected the growing global consensus against imperialism and the right of peoples to determine their own destinies. The political landscape was shifting dramatically, and the former colonial powers could no longer dictate the terms of global order in the same way they had before. However, the end of empire did not mean the immediate end of Western influence. For many newly independent nations, the legacy of colonialism persisted in the form of economic dependency, cultural influence, and political interference. Former colonial powers, particularly Britain, France, and Belgium, sought to retain their influence over former colonies through various means, from military alliances and economic aid to covert interventions and political manipulation. In some cases, Western powers actively sought to prevent the rise of socialist or left-leaning governments in these new nations, fearing the spread of communism. This played out in several proxy wars, where former colonies became battlegrounds for superpower rivalry, as exemplified by the conflicts in Vietnam, Angola, and the Congo. In response to this, the Nonaligned Movement, NAM, took on a central role in challenging the dominance of both the United States and the Soviet Union. Founded in 1961 by figures like Jawaharlal Nehru of India, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Sukarno of Indonesia, the NAM sought to create a neutral bloc of countries that would neither align with the capitalist West nor the communist East. This was a bold vision, one that would allow the global South to pursue its own interests without being coerced into the ideological struggle of the Cold War. The NAM's declaration emphasized peace, sovereignty, and independence, and it provided a platform for smaller nations to come together, discuss common issues, and assert their place in global decision-making. Despite the challenges, the decolonization process also allowed many former colonies to take control of their own economic destinies, although this was not without difficulty. Colonial powers had extracted immense wealth from their colonies through the exploitation of natural resources, cheap labor, and trade monopolies. The legacy of this exploitation left new nations with economies that were dependent on exports, heavily reliant on foreign markets, and often deeply impoverished. Attempts to break free from this dependency led to the pursuit of various economic strategies, such as land reform, nationalization of industries, and economic planning. However, the path to economic independence was complicated, often hindered by internal political instability, corruption, and external pressures. One of the most significant challenges faced by post-colonial nations was the need to modernize their economies in a world that was rapidly becoming more interconnected. In many cases, the newly independent countries sought aid from international institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund (IMF), which offered loans for development projects. However, these loans often came with strings attached, such as requirements for economic liberalization, privatization of state-owned industries, and austerity measures that could exacerbate poverty. The rise of multinational corporations, which had roots in colonial economies, further complicated efforts for economic self-determination, as they continued to extract resources and profits from these countries, often leaving little behind in terms of long-term development. At the same time, newly independent nations sought to assert their cultural identities and reclaim the heritage that had been suppressed or distorted by colonial rule. This cultural renaissance became an integral part of the decolonization process, as art, literature, and music became powerful tools for expressing the struggles and aspirations of formerly colonized peoples. In the post-colonial world, writers like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Wole Soyinka brought forward stories of resistance, resilience, and the complexities of identity in the face of colonial legacies. These writers were not only reclaiming their past but were also shaping their futures, challenging the dominant narratives imposed by colonial powers and offering alternative visions of what it meant to be truly free. Decolonization also had a profound impact on the relationships between the former colonial powers and their colonies. In some cases, former imperial powers struggled to maintain their relationships with former colonies, even as they shifted from direct control to more indirect forms of influence. In France, for example, the loss of its empire in Africa led to the establishment of a complex relationship known as Francafrique, in which France maintained significant economic, military, and political ties to its former colonies. Similarly, the United Kingdom's relationship with its former colonies evolved into the Commonwealth, an organization designed to promote political cooperation, trade, and cultural exchange among its member states. However, the Commonwealth was often criticized for its unequal power dynamics, as the former colonial powers retained significant influence over the affairs of the newly independent nations. By the late 20th century, the global landscape had shifted dramatically. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 further reshaped the geopolitical order, leaving the United States as the sole superpower. For many former colonies, this was a moment of opportunity, as they looked to engage more directly with the global economy. Globalization, driven by technological advancements and international trade agreements, opened up new avenues for economic growth, but it also brought new challenges. The economic disparities between the global North and South persisted, and the impact of globalization was often felt unevenly. While some countries, particularly in Asia, experienced rapid economic growth, others faced rising inequality, political instability, and social unrest. The end of the Cold War also marked the beginning of a new phase in global politics, in which the concepts of democracy, human rights, and international cooperation became central. While the decolonization process had granted independence to former colonies, the challenge now was to build inclusive, democratic societies that could overcome the divisions and legacies of colonialism. The growth of civil society organizations, the expansion of democratic governance, and the rise of international human rights norms provided hope for a more equitable world order. But challenges remained, as political corruption, inequality, and the persistence of poverty continued to hinder the progress of many post-colonial nations. In the modern era, decolonization remains an unfinished process. Many former colonies continue to grapple with the social, economic, and political consequences of their colonial pasts. Issues such as land redistribution, reparations, and the recovery of stolen cultural artifacts remain contentious, and debates over the legacy of colonialism continue to shape the political discourse in many countries. In addition, the fight for environmental justice, particularly in regions that were heavily exploited by colonial powers, has become an essential aspect of the post-colonial struggle. The global power dynamics that emerge from decolonization are not static, they are ever evolving. As the 21st century progresses, new challenges and opportunities continue to arise. The shift of economic power to Asia, the rise of new global players such as China and India, and the growing importance of issues like climate change, migration, and technological innovation will all play significant roles in shaping the future of global relations. But one thing is certain, the impact of decolonization will continue to echo through the corridors of international power, reminding us of the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality that has defined the journey of formerly colonized peoples. The struggle for independence was not only a battle between nations and imperial powers, it was also a fight for identity, dignity, and recognition of the fundamental rights of marginalized groups. Among the most crucial, though often overlooked, contributors to decolonization were women. In many colonized societies, women played pivotal roles in the resistance movements, the creation of new national identities, and the rebuilding of fractured nations. Yet, as these societies gained independence, the post-colonial world would often marginalize women's contributions, relegating them to secondary roles in the political and social structures of their newly formed states. The fight for gender equality in the post-colonial era was far from simple. In many ways, it was as much a part of the decolonization process as the political battle for self-rule. For women across the globe, colonialism had imposed not just political and economic oppression but also cultural, social, and gendered hierarchies that diminished their roles in society. In colonies, women were often seen as second-class citizens, subjected to the strictures of colonial law, patriarchal systems, and cultural norms that both reinforced and exacerbated gender inequality. Yet, colonialism also inadvertently contributed to the emergence of strong female figures who would lead the charge in the post-colonial era. The very act of colonization forced women to confront and often reject traditional gender roles. They were compelled to step into roles of leadership, resilience, and resistance, and in doing so, they became central to the fight for independence. Across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, women took up arms, led protests, and mobilized communities in ways that were often unrecognized in the official histories of decolonization. Perhaps one of the most famous examples is the role of women in Algeria's War of Independence. The Algerian National Liberation Front, FLN, recruited women to fight in the war, acknowledging their ability to operate covertly in ways that men could not. Women like Zora Driff and Jamila Bapacha became symbols of resistance, not only because of their courage on the battlefield but because of their ability to challenge the gender norms imposed by both colonial rule and their own societies. These women fought for the liberation of Algeria, but in doing so, they also paved the way for the broader liberation of women within the new post-colonial society. However, despite the invaluable contributions of women to decolonization movements, the newly independent states often failed to deliver on promises of gender equality. Once the battle for independence was won, the focus shifted to the construction of new nation-states, where traditional patriarchal values frequently dominated. In many cases, the revolutionary movements, despite their anti-colonial rhetoric, did not have the political will to challenge deeply ingrained gender norms. The post-colonial leaders, who were primarily male, often saw the emancipation of women as a secondary issue, one that could be addressed later, if at all. In many newly independent countries, the political structures remained dominated by men, with women relegated to roles that were viewed as supportive rather than central to the nation-building process. The political and economic spheres of these societies were male-dominated, and women found it difficult to break into these areas of power. While some women did gain political office, such as Sirimavo Bandaranik, who became the first female Prime Minister of Sri Lanka in 1960, or Indira Gandhi, who became the Prime Minister of India in 1966, these figures were the exception rather than the rule. Their leadership did not necessarily challenge the gendered structures of power but rather reinforced the notion that leadership, like the structures of colonial rule, was largely a male-dominated affair. Even when women were granted the right to vote and participate in politics, their participation was often restricted or superficial. Gender-based violence, legal inequalities, and cultural traditions continued to keep women in subordinate roles within their societies. In countries like India, for example, while women had gained the right to vote in 1947, many of the laws and cultural practices that restricted women's freedom were left largely untouched. In some instances, women's participation in political life was treated as a form of tokenism, with their representation in the legislature often minimal. But despite these challenges, the post-colonial world was also a space in which women began to build new movements, push for social reforms, and demand their place in the political process. From the feminist movements in Latin America to the women's liberation movements in Africa, women became an integral part of the process of redefining what it meant to be free in the post-colonial era. These movements were diverse, drawing on local traditions, cultures, and political contexts, but they shared a common goal: to challenge both the legacies of colonialism and the persistent patriarchy that continued to define post-colonial societies. In Africa, the development of women's movements was both a response to colonialism and a part of the broader struggle for social justice. In countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and Kenya, women were instrumental in pushing for political and economic change. They organized protests, led strikes, and even participated in armed resistance. One notable example is the 1929 ABA women's riots in Nigeria, where thousands of women took to the streets to protest colonial taxes and policies that undermined their livelihoods. This protest was not just about resistance to colonial rule but about challenging the gendered nature of colonial policies that disproportionately affected women. Similarly, in Latin America, the post-colonial period saw the rise of powerful feminist movements that worked to address the intersection of gender, race, and class. In countries like Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, women organized to challenge both the legacy of colonialism and the social systems that continued to oppress them. These movements, though initially focused on securing legal rights for women, expanded to include demands for economic justice, sexual autonomy, and the end of gender-based violence. Women in these regions became powerful voices for social change, both within their countries and in the broader global context. As the 20th century drew to a close, the global women's movement grew into a formidable force for change. International organizations like the United Nations Women's Committee, along with grassroots organizations, began to press for more aggressive action on behalf of women's rights, particularly in post-colonial societies. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, adopted by the UN in 1979, became a vital instrument in promoting gender equality worldwide. Many post-colonial nations, having signed on to this treaty, were compelled to address issues such as child marriage, female education, reproductive rights, and gender-based violence. As the years have passed since the formal end of colonialism, its legacy continues to shape contemporary global politics in profound ways. The decolonization process, while providing newfound independence to many nations, did not fully erase the consequences of centuries of imperial rule. In fact, it is impossible to understand the complexities of today's global order without examining the enduring impacts of colonialism, from economic inequalities and political struggles to issues of identity, race, and cultural preservation. The first and most glaring consequence of colonialism in the modern world is the persistence of economic inequality. When colonial powers withdrew from their colonies, they left behind economies that were often deeply dependent on the exploitation of natural resources and cheap labor. These economies, designed to benefit the imperial powers, were rarely diversified or developed in a way that would enable them to thrive independently after independence. The newly independent nations inherited economies that were often underdeveloped, their infrastructure poor, and their industries fragile. The colonial-era economic structures have had lasting consequences. Many former colonies found themselves stuck in a cycle of poverty, with limited access to technology, education, and capital. The global financial system, which had been shaped by colonial powers, favored the rich nations of the global north and left the global south vulnerable to exploitation by multinational corporations, which continued to extract wealth from these regions. This economic imbalance remains evident today, as the nations that were once colonized continue to face struggles in achieving economic self-sufficiency. The legacy of colonial economic policies is also evident in the way global trade is conducted. In many parts of the world, particularly in Africa and Latin America, former colonies continue to rely heavily on the export of raw materials and agricultural products, often to the same countries that once controlled them. This creates a situation in which these nations remain at the mercy of global market forces and commodity prices, leaving them vulnerable to economic fluctuations. Moreover, colonial trade networks continue to shape global supply chains, and the exploitation of resources from the global south by northern corporations remains a contentious issue. Political structures in many post-colonial nations also bear the imprint of their colonial pasts. Colonial powers imposed systems of governance that were often artificial, drawing borders without regard for local cultures, ethnicities, or historical divisions. These borders have frequently led to ethnic conflict and political instability in the post-colonial period. Nations that were artificially divided by colonial borders have often found it difficult to establish cohesive national identities or stable political systems. In some cases, the legacies of colonial rule have left behind deeply divided societies, where ethnic, religious, or regional tensions persist and where political struggles are exacerbated by historical grievances. A striking example of this can be seen in the Middle East. When the British and French empires carved up the Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of World War I, they drew borders with little consideration for the region's ethnic and sectarian divisions. This has led to ongoing conflicts and tensions that continue to plague the region today, from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the rise of ISIS and the civil war in Syria. Similarly, the colonial partitioning of Africa left behind artificial borders that contributed to numerous ethnic conflicts and civil wars in the post-colonial period. The consequences of these colonial-era decisions are still felt in many of the world's most fragile and conflict-ridden states. In addition to the economic and political legacies, colonialism left a significant mark on the cultural and social fabric of post-colonial nations. The imposition of foreign languages, religions, and cultural norms during colonial rule often led to the erosion of indigenous cultures. In many parts of the world, colonized peoples were taught to view their own traditions, languages, and histories as inferior to those of their colonizers. The effects of this cultural imperialism are still evident today, as many post-colonial societies struggle with questions of identity and cultural preservation. The struggle for identity in post-colonial societies has often been a tension between reclaiming indigenous traditions and navigating the influence of globalized, Western-centric cultures. In many countries, the legacy of colonialism has led to a sense of cultural alienation, as people attempt to reconcile the demands of modernity with the desire to preserve their traditional ways of life. Post-colonial literature, art, and music have been instrumental in reclaiming and reasserting indigenous identities. Writers like Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Frantz Fanon have provided frameworks through which colonized people could come to terms with their past and forge new national identities based on a recognition of their indigenous cultures. Colonialism has also had a profound effect on race relations in the post-colonial world. The concept of race was systematically constructed and codified by colonial powers to justify the subjugation of indigenous populations. The legacy of these racial hierarchies continues to shape race relations today, particularly in former colonial powers like the United Kingdom, France, and the United States, where colonial ideologies have given rise to systemic racism and discrimination. In countries across the globe, people of African, Asian, and indigenous descent continue to struggle with the impacts of colonial racism, from discriminatory immigration policies to the underrepresentation of marginalized groups in politics, media, and academia. The Global South, which was once the primary battleground for decolonization, continues to face struggles for sovereignty, self-determination, and autonomy. While the end of formal colonial rule did lead to the creation of new independent states, the global power structure remains dominated by the West. Western nations continue to hold the majority of political and economic power, and international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the United Nations often perpetuate the interests of the global North. Post-colonial nations, while officially independent, are often forced to navigate global policies and systems that are still largely shaped by their former colonial rulers. In the 21st century, the persistence of these colonial legacies has given rise to new forms of resistance and global solidarity. Movements for reparations, land restitution, and the return of stolen cultural artifacts have gained momentum, as former colonies demand justice for the wrongs of the past. These movements seek not only to right historical wrongs but also to challenge the structures of global inequality that continue to perpetuate colonial patterns of exploitation. The global reckoning with colonialism has become a central theme in debates over historical memory, justice, and the future of global governance. As we move further into the 21st century, the impact of colonialism on the world order remains undeniable. Yet the future of post-colonial nations and their place in global politics is a subject of immense debate and significance. The question of what comes after decolonization, and how nations that were once colonies can navigate the complexities of modernity, economic development, and global influence, remains at the forefront of many political discussions. What does it mean for a nation to truly be independent in the modern world? Can the legacy of colonialism ever be fully eradicated? Or are there irreversible imprints that will continue to shape these nations for generations to come? The challenges faced by post-colonial nations are not just about overcoming the historical weight of colonialism, but also about responding to the demands of a rapidly changing global landscape. Globalization, technological advancement, and the rise of new economic powers are reshaping the world order, presenting both opportunities and obstacles for former colonies. While these nations have made significant strides since their independence, many still find themselves grappling with the aftermath of centuries of imperial exploitation. One of the most pressing challenges for post-colonial nations is the issue of economic development. Despite achieving political independence, many former colonies remain economically dependent on the global market systems that were created by colonial powers. These nations often struggle with underdeveloped infrastructures, limited access to capital, and industries that were designed to serve the needs of their colonizers rather than their own citizens. For example, the economies of many African nations continue to rely heavily on the extraction of natural resources, such as oil, minerals, and agricultural products, leaving them vulnerable to global price fluctuations and economic exploitation. Similarly, many Asian and Latin American countries face challenges in diversifying their economies and building robust industrial sectors that can compete on the global stage. The global financial system, which has its roots in the colonial era, still presents significant hurdles for these nations. Institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund (IMF), and the World Trade Organization (WTO) are often seen as perpetuating the unequal economic relations that were established during the colonial period. These institutions have been criticized for imposing economic policies on developing countries that prioritize austerity, privatization, and market liberalization, often to the detriment of the local population. The conditions imposed by these international financial institutions frequently lead to economic instability, unemployment, and increased poverty, rather than the development they were meant to foster. In response to these challenges, many post-colonial nations have turned to alternative models of development. China, which has a history of colonization and imperialism in its own right, has emerged as a major player in the global South, providing an alternative to Western-dominated economic models. Through its Belt and Road Initiative, China has been investing heavily in infrastructure projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, offering developing nations access to capital, technology, and markets. This has created new opportunities for economic development, but it has also raised concerns about the potential for a new form of neocolonialism, with China wielding considerable influence over the economies of these nations. For many post-colonial nations, the path to economic independence is intricately linked to the struggle for greater political autonomy and the dismantling of old colonial structures. However, political instability continues to plague many of these nations. The creation of artificial borders during the colonial era has left behind fractured societies, often divided along ethnic, religious, or linguistic lines. In many instances, post-colonial leaders have struggled to unite these diverse groups under a single national identity, leading to ethnic violence, civil wars, and the rise of authoritarian regimes. The challenge of building inclusive political systems that reflect the diverse realities of post-colonial societies is one of the central issues for many nations today. In Africa, for example, the legacy of colonialism has often manifested in political instability, with newly formed states facing ongoing struggles for power and control. Countries such as Somalia, Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo have experienced prolonged periods of conflict, and the roots of these crises can often be traced back to the arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers, which ignored the complex ethnic and cultural realities of the continent. The struggle for self-determination and national unity in many African nations continues to this day, as political leaders and civil society groups work to overcome the legacies of colonialism and build stable, inclusive states. In Latin America, the political dynamics of post-colonial countries are similarly complicated by the enduring influence of colonial history. While many nations gained independence in the 19th century, the political structures left behind by colonial powers were often weak, corrupt, and prone to authoritarianism. In the 20th century, many Latin American nations experienced military coups, revolutionary movements, and dictatorships, as the struggle for democracy and political stability continued. Today, while many of these countries have transitioned to democratic systems, they still face challenges such as widespread inequality, corruption, and the enduring influence of foreign powers. Despite the challenges, many post-colonial nations have made significant strides in achieving political and social progress. In South Africa, the end of apartheid marked the triumph of a long struggle for racial equality, and the country is now regarded as one of the continent's most stable democracies. Similarly, in India, the world's largest democracy, the post-colonial struggle for independence has led to the establishment of a thriving political system, though it continues to grapple with issues such as religious intolerance, caste-based discrimination, and regional disparities. In the realm of culture, post-colonial nations have worked tirelessly to reclaim their histories and traditions, often in direct opposition to the Western-centric narratives that were imposed during colonial rule. Post-colonial literature, art, and music have become essential tools for expressing resistance and redefining national identities. Writers such as Salman Rushdie, Arundhati Roy, and Aikwe Arma have used literature as a means of interrogating the legacies of colonialism and exploring the complexities of post-colonial identity. The global reach of these works has allowed for a wider audience to engage with the issues faced by post-colonial nations, bringing attention to the ongoing struggles for justice and equality.